A lively pool party turns into chaos when a group of bikers, known for their rough attitudes, makes the mistake of picking a fight with a seemingly laid-back yet observant guest. This soldier, who's just returned from active duty, hides his exceptional skills and a compassionate heart behind a humble demeanor. The sun blazed high above the suburban neighborhood, casting shimmering reflections on the clear blue surface of the community pool. Laughter and music filled the air as neighbors gathered for the annual summer pool party, a tradition meant to bring the community together. Children splashed in the shallow end, while adults clustered around the grill, exchanging stories and clinking soda cans in the heat of the day. Dante Cruz stood on the edge of the gathering, a faint smile tugging at his lips. His well-worn leather boots contrasted with the flip-flops and casual sneakers worn by others, a subtle reminder of the life he'd recently left behind. Clad in a simple t-shirt and jeans, he might have passed as any other guest, if not for his watchful eyes, scanning the crowd with quiet precision. "Dante," called Marco, his childhood friend and the reason he was here. Marco waved a spatula like a banner, flipping burgers on the grill with exaggerated flair. "Quit standing there looking like a bodyguard and join the party. You're making everyone nervous." Dante chuckled and ambled over, his relaxed stride belying the tension still humming in his muscles. It had been only 2 weeks since he'd returned from his final tour in the army. He was home, but adjusting to civilian life was proving to be more difficult than he'd anticipated. "I'm not trying to scare anyone," Dante said, grabbing a cold bottle of water from the cooler. "I'm just observing." "Well, stop observing and start enjoying," Marco insisted. "You've earned it." Before Dante could respond, the growl of motorcycle engines shattered the easy rhythm of the party. Heads turned as a line of bikes roared into the parking lot, their riders clad in black leather jackets and heavy boots. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and an overabundance of tattoos, killed his engine and swung off his bike with a practiced swagger. "Looks like the circus came to town," Marco muttered under his breath. Dante's smile tightened as he watched the bikers stride into the party uninvited, their loud banter and sharp laughter cutting through the crowd's previously relaxed mood. The leader, Brutus, surveyed the gathering like a king inspecting his subjects. "What a nice little shindig you've got here," Brutus announced, his voice dripping with mockery. "Hope you don't mind if we join in." No one dared challenge them, and the party host, a petite woman named Clara, looked visibly uncomfortable as she forced a smile and nodded. "Of course, help yourselves." The bikers didn't need further encouragement. They swarmed the food table, grabbing plates and drinks without a word of thanks. Brutus sauntered toward the pool, shoving a group of teenagers aside as he claimed the best lounge chair. Dante's jaw tightened. He knew the type. Men like Brutus thrived on intimidation, feeding off the fear and submission of others. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He wasn't here to play hero. He was here to relax, to rejoin the world he'd been fighting for all these years. But Brutus seemed intent on testing his resolve. As the party tried to return to normal, Brutus's crew grew louder and rowdier. One of them turned the music up to an ear-splitting volume, drowning out conversation. Another grabbed a beach ball from a group of kids and tossed it into the pool with exaggerated force, scattering water over several startled adults. Laughter erupted from the gang, but the rest of the partygoers exchanged uneasy glances. Marco sidled up to Dante, his face pinched with worry. "This is gonna get ugly if someone doesn't step in." Dante took a deep breath, weighing his options. He didn't want to cause a scene, but his instincts were screaming at him to act. Before he could decide, Brutus made the choice for him. The biker leader had zeroed in on a young couple sitting near the edge of the pool. They were shy, barely out of their teens, and clearly intimidated by Brutus's towering presence as he loomed over them. "Hey, lovebirds," Brutus said, his grin more of a sneer. "Why don't you let the grown-ups have your seats?" The boys stammered, trying to explain that they'd been sitting there first, but Brutus wasn't interested in reason. With a flick of his wrist, he grabbed the boy's soda can and poured it onto the ground. Dante moved before he could think. In 3 swift steps he was standing between Brutus and the couple, his expression calm but unyielding. "That's enough," Dante said, his voice steady but firm. "Let them enjoy their day." Brutus turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the newcomer. "Who invited Captain America?" he sneered. "You got something to say, tough guy?" "I already said it," Dante replied. "Back off." The party had gone silent, all eyes fixed on the confrontation. For a moment it seemed Brutus might back down, but then he laughed, a harsh barking sound, and shoved Dante's shoulder. "You think you can tell me what to do?" Brutus growled. "You've got no idea who you're messing with." Dante didn't flinch. "Maybe I don't, but I know this isn't your party, and these people don't deserve your crap." The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Dante's calm defiance. Brutus glanced around, realizing he was no longer the center of attention. His grip tightened into a fist, but before he could act, one of his crew grabbed his arm. "Not here, man," the biker muttered. "Let it go." Brutus glared at Dante, his lips curling into a snarl. "This ain't over," he hissed before storming off toward his bike. As the bikers revved their engines and peeled out of the parking lot, the tension in the air slowly dissipated. The crowd erupted into applause, but Dante waved it off, his focus on the young couple still sitting wide-eyed by the pool. "You okay?" he asked. They nodded, thanking him profusely, but Dante barely heard them. His mind was already working, analyzing the situation and the potential consequences. He knew Brutus wasn't the type to let a perceived slight go unanswered. As the party resumed and the laughter returned, Dante allowed himself a brief smile. The day was far from over, and something told him it was going to be a long one. The pool party's earlier buzz of laughter and camaraderie had been replaced by a tense undercurrent. Brutus and his crew had effectively claimed the party as their own, with little regard for the hosts or the other guests. Their mocking jeers and raucous behavior disrupted the easygoing vibe, leaving most attendees shifting uneasily and whispering among themselves. Brutus, his leather boots propped up on the poolside table, surveyed the scene with a smug grin. He raised his voice above the music, drawing unwanted attention. "This is what a real party looks like. Loosen up, folks, or maybe this little town doesn't know how to have fun." He tossed a beer can into the pool, earning a few gasps from nearby children. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a patchy beard, hoarded snacks from the food table, spilling chips across the grass as he stuffed his face. Another gang member cranked the music even louder, the heavy bass shaking the cheap plastic chairs. Dante Cruz leaned against a tree, watching the scene unfold with quiet scrutiny. He had hoped the bikers would eventually lose interest and leave, but it was clear they were settling in for the long haul. Marco joined him, frowning as he handed Dante a soda. "They're ruining the party," Marco muttered, "and no one's doing anything about it." Dante sipped his drink, his gaze fixed on Brutus. "People like them thrive on fear and attention. If they don't get it, they usually get bored." Marco snorted. "Usually? And what about the times they don't?" Dante didn't answer. His time in the military had taught him to pick his battles carefully, but he also knew that standing by while bullies ran rampant wasn't an option. He was still weighing his next move when Brutus stood and made his way toward the drink station, where Clara, the party host, was nervously arranging cups. "Hey there, sweetheart," Brutus drawled, leaning in too close. "Got anything stronger than soda back here?" Clara stepped back, clutching a pitcher of lemonade like a shield. I'm afraid not. This is a family party." Brutus laughed, a loud, grating sound that drew the attention of his crew. "Family party, huh? Well, don't mind us. We're just here to liven things up." Dante's grip on his soda can tightened. Clara's discomfort was palpable, and her attempts to politely diffuse the situation were only met with more laughter. Brutus reached for the pitcher, his movements exaggerated as if mocking her. "Don't worry, darling. I'll help myself." Before Brutus could take it, Dante stepped forward, his calm but authoritative voice cutting through the noise. "She said no." The words hung in the air, silencing the bikers and drawing the attention of the rest of the party. Brutus turned, his amusement replaced by irritation as he sized up Dante. "Well, well," Brutus said, his lips curling into a sneer. "If it isn't the party cop." Dante didn't flinch under Brutus's glare. "This is her party. You don't get to intimidate her, or anyone else." Brutus chuckled, though the sound lacked humor. "And who's going to stop me? You." "I don't want to escalate things," Dante replied evenly, "but I won't stand by and let you ruin the day for everyone else." Brutus stepped closer, his chest puffed out in an attempt to intimidate. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but you don't know who you're messing with, soldier boy." Dante's eyebrows lifted slightly. "How did you?" "Those boots, that posture, you scream military," Brutus said, jabbing a finger toward Dante. "I've dealt with your kind before, all discipline and no bite." The tension between them was thick enough to cut, and the other guests were frozen in place watching the standoff unfold. Marco moved closer, ready to intervene if needed, but Dante gave him a subtle shake of the head. "I'm not looking for trouble," Dante said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm asking you to show some respect and let everyone enjoy the party." Brutus leaned in, his face inches from Dante's. "Respect? That's earned, not asked for, and you haven't earned a damn thing from me." For a moment it seemed Brutus might take a swing, but one of his crew stepped in, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Come on, Brutus," the man said quietly. "Not here." Brutus scowled but relented, backing off with a derisive laugh. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood, hero." As Brutus rejoined his crew, Dante felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He turned back to Clara, who offered a shaky smile of gratitude, and then returned to his spot by the tree. "That was risky," Marco said, his voice low. "You think he's going to let it go?" "No," Dante admitted, "but he's not my main concern." Marco frowned. "Then what is?" Dante's eyes scanned the crowd, lingering on the children playing in the shallow end of the pool. "Making sure this party doesn't turn into something worse." The rest of the afternoon passed uneasily. While Brutus and his crew continued their disruptive antics, they steered clear of Dante, shooting him occasional glares but keeping their distance. Still, the damage to the party's atmosphere was done. Conversations were hushed, laughter subdued, as everyone tried to pretend the uninvited guests weren't looming over the event like storm clouds. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn, Brutus gathered his crew and headed toward the bikes. For a moment, Dante thought they might leave, but Brutus paused, turning back to lock eyes with him. "This ain't over, soldier," Brutus called, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll see you round." With that, the bikers roared out of the parking lot, leaving a trail of tension and unease in their wake. The party slowly began to recover, but Dante couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The party had begun to regain some semblance of normalcy after the bikers' dramatic exit, though the tension they left behind lingered like an unwelcome guest. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, and the children, cautiously optimistic, returned to the pool. Dante remained by the edge of the gathering, his presence steady and watchful, like a lighthouse in rough seas. Marco handed him another soda, his brow furrowed. "You think they'll come back?" "They will," Dante said quietly, his eyes scanning the parking lot. "Men like Brutus don't take well to being challenged. They'll want to save face." Marco sighed, shaking his head. "I don't know what you were thinking, stepping in like that. I mean, I'm glad you did, but still." Dante gave him a faint smile. "I was thinking that sometimes you have to stand up to bullies. If you don't, they'll just keep going." The words were barely out of his mouth when the unmistakable growl of motorcycle engines echoed in the distance. Marco paled, and Dante's expression hardened, his body instinctively tensing. The bikers were back. This time, they didn't bother parking. Instead, the group of 5 roared onto the grass, skidding to a halt near the pool. Brutus dismounted first, his face set in a sneer that was equal parts anger and amusement. "Miss me," he called, spreading his arms wide as if expecting applause. The partygoers froze, their earlier attempts at normalcy shattered. A few began edging toward their cars, while others clutched their children close. Dante stepped forward, his movements deliberate but calm. "Brutus," he said evenly, "I thought you'd had enough for one day." Brutus chuckled, the sound harsh and grating. "Oh, I'm just getting started. You embarrassed me earlier, soldier boy. Made me look weak in front of my crew. Now I've got to remind everyone who's really in charge." The tension was palpable as Brutus gestured to one of his men, who handed him a cooler filled with water balloons. Brutus grinned, holding one up like a prize. "Time to lighten the mood, don't you think?" Dante's jaw tightened as he realized what was about to happen. Brutus turned his attention to a young couple sitting near the pool, the same pair he had targeted earlier. They were clearly trying to avoid eye contact, their unease written all over their faces. "Hey, lovebirds," Brutus called, tossing a balloon from hand to hand. "Catch!" Before they could react, he lobbed the balloon in their direction. It hit the young man square in the chest, exploding in a spray of cold water. The bikers erupted in laughter, but the couple looked mortified, their faces flushing with humiliation. Dante moved before Brutus could throw another. He stepped between the bikers and the couple, his voice firm but measured. "That's enough." The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a tense silence. Brutus stared at Dante, his grin fading. "You've got a real habit of sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Dante met his gaze without flinching. "And you've got a real habit of picking on people who can't fight back." Brutus's eyes narrowed, his hand clenching the water balloon as if debating whether to throw it. The other bikers shifted uneasily, glancing between their leader and Dante. One of them, a younger man named Marco, hesitated, his discomfort evident. "Brutus," Marco said quietly. "Maybe we should just go." Brutus rounded on him, his voice sharp. "Shut it, Marco. I'm handling this." Marco held up his hands in surrender but didn't look convinced. Dante took note, filing the moment away for later. He turned his attention back to Brutus, his tone steady. "You want to prove something?" Dante asked. "Prove it to me. Leave them out of it." Brutus smirked, tossing the balloon back into the cooler. "Oh, I'll prove something, all right. But not here. Not now. You'll get your turn, soldier." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You just made this personal." The threat hung in the air as Brutus signaled to his crew. Reluctantly, they mounted their bikes, though Marco shot Dante an unreadable look before following. The roar of their engines faded into the distance, leaving behind a shaken crowd. Dante turned to the young couple, offering a reassuring smile. "You okay?" They nodded, their gratitude evident but their words failing them. Marco joined Dante, his face a mix of relief and concern. "That could have gone a lot worse." "It's not over," Dante said simply. Marco frowned. "What do you mean?" Dante sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Brutus isn't the type to let this go. He's coming back, and next time, it won't be just water balloons." The rest of the party passed in a state of uneasy calm. Though the bikers were gone, their presence lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. Dante stayed until the last guest had left, helping Clara clean up and making sure everyone got to their cars safely. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of orange and pink, Dante finally allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. The fight wasn't over, but for now, he had done what he could to protect the people around him. He didn't know what Brutus had planned, but he did know one thing. Whatever came next, he'd be ready. The air outside was still and heavy, the kind of silence that usually preceded a storm. Dante sat on the edge of the pool, his feet skimming the surface of the water. The remnants of the party had been cleaned up, and the neighborhood was quiet once again. Marco had long since gone home, but Dante lingered, his thoughts miles away. The confrontation with Brutus had stirred something in him, something he'd been trying to leave behind. Memories of his time in the military came rushing back, unbidden but vivid, as if they'd happened just yesterday. It had been his third deployment, deep in an arid desert halfway across the world. The mission had seemed straightforward on paper: secure a small village under threat from insurgents and provide aid to the locals. But Dante had quickly learned that no mission was ever as simple as it seemed. The village was a patchwork of crumbling adobe buildings and narrow dirt streets, its people weary and distrustful. Dante's unit had set up a temporary base just outside its borders. Their presence met with cautious curiosity. The villagers needed protection, but they also feared what that protection might bring. Dante had always prided himself on connecting with people, even in the most hostile environments. While others saw only risk, he saw humanity. He spent his free hours helping to rebuild walls, carrying water, and playing soccer with the kids. It was in those moments, amidst laughter and gratitude, that he found purpose. But the peace was short-lived. One night, the base was attacked. The insurgents struck with brutal efficiency, their assault a blur of gunfire and chaos. Dante remembered the shouts of his comrades, the acrid smell of smoke, and the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he fought to protect the village. It wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle to defend the people he'd come to care about. By dawn, the attack was repelled, but the cost was high. Several soldiers were injured, and a few villagers had been caught in the crossfire. Dante had carried a young boy, no older than 8, to the medic's tent, his small body limp and lifeless. The image haunted him, a stark reminder of the fragile line between heroism and devastation. The village was eventually secured, and Dante's unit was hailed as heroes. But the victory felt hollow. He couldn't shake the guilt, the nagging thought that he hadn't done enough. It was a feeling he carried with him long after he returned home, shaping the man he had become. Dante's reflection rippled in the pool as he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. The memories had a way of creeping in during quiet moments, reminding him of the weight he carried. They were why he couldn't ignore people like Brutus, why he couldn't stand by while others suffered. He was lost in thought when a voice pulled him back to the present. "Hey, you okay?" Dante turned to see Sarah, one of the party guests, standing a few feet away. She was holding a plate of leftover cake, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. He hadn't spoken much to her during the party, but she had a warm, approachable energy that was hard to ignore. "Yeah," he said, offering a faint smile. "Just thinking." Sarah walked over and sat beside him, setting the plate between them. "About the bikers?" "Partly," Dante admitted, "but mostly about why guys like Brutus do what they do." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You mean besides being jerks?" Dante chuckled softly. "It's not always that simple. People like him, there's usually something deeper driving them. Anger, insecurity, a need to prove themselves. Doesn't excuse their behavior, but it helps to understand it." Sarah studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "You sound like someone who's been through a lot." Dante didn't answer right away. He wasn't used to sharing his past, especially with people he barely knew, but something about Sarah's presence felt safe, unjudging. "I've seen my share," he said finally. "The military teaches you a lot about people, how to help them, how to protect them, but it also shows you how much damage they can do to each other." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "Well, I think it's pretty incredible what you did today. Standing up to Brutus like that, it took guts." "Or stupidity," Dante said with a wry smile. "He's not the kind of guy who backs down easily." "No, but you didn't either. Sarah pointed out, and that made a difference. You gave people hope. Dante looked at her, surprised by the conviction in her voice. Hope, huh? Yeah, she said firmly. Hope that someone will stand up for what's right, that not everyone's afraid to do the hard thing. Her words struck a chord, echoing the lessons he'd learned in the military and the ideals he tried to live by. For the first time that evening, Dante felt a glimmer of peace amidst the storm brewing around him. They sat in companionable silence for a while, sharing the cake and watching the moonlight dance on the water. As the night deepened, Sarah stood, brushing crumbs from her hands. I should probably get going, she said, but if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm around. Dante nodded, grateful for the offer. Thanks, Sarah. I'll keep that in mind. She smiled and walked away, leaving Dante alone with his thoughts once more. But this time, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. As he stared out at the now still pool, Dante made a silent promise to himself. Whatever Brutus had planned, he would face it head-on, not out of pride or a need to win, but because it was the right thing to do, and because the world needed more hope, even in the face of chaos. The following day dawned with a deceptive calm. The neighborhood, bathed in soft morning light, seemed to have returned to its usual rhythm. Birds chirped in the trees, children rode bicycles along the sidewalks, and the faint hum of lawnmowers filled the air. To an outsider, it was an idyllic suburban scene. But for Dante, the sense of unease from the previous day hadn't dissipated. Dante stood in his small backyard, carefully tending to the plants his mother had left behind before her passing. Gardening wasn't something he'd ever seen himself doing, but it grounded him, offering a quiet contrast to the chaos he'd faced in the military. As he dug his hands into the soil, he heard the distinct rumble of motorcycle engines in the distance. He froze, his senses sharpening. The sound grew louder, then faded, and finally stopped altogether. Dante exhaled, realizing the bikers weren't heading to his street, at least not yet. Still, the interruption left him on edge. Later that afternoon, Dante decided to walk to a nearby park, hoping a change of scenery might ease his mind. He passed families picnicking on the grass and joggers moving along the trail. The normalcy was a stark contrast to the storm brewing within him. He hadn't told Marco or anyone else, but he knew Brutus wouldn't let things lie. Bullies rarely did. Dante reached a quiet bench under the shade of a large oak tree and sat down. As he sipped from a water bottle, a voice broke his solitude. Mind if I join you? Dante looked up to see Marco, one of Brutus's gang members, standing a few feet away. The young man's hands were shoved into his jacket pockets, and his posture was hesitant, almost sheepish. Dante considered the request for a moment, then nodded. Marco sat down, keeping a careful distance between them. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the rustling of leaves and distant laughter from the playground. Finally, Marco cleared his throat. Look, I'm not here to cause trouble, he said, his voice low. I needed to talk to you. Dante glanced at him, his expression unreadable. About? About Brutus, Marco admitted, and what happened yesterday. Dante leaned back against the bench, studying the younger man. Go on. Marco shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed on the ground. He's angry, like really angry. He thinks you made him look weak, and he's not going to let that slide. He's planning something. What kind of something? Dante asked, his tone calm but firm. Marco hesitated, his jaw tightening. I don't know all the details, but I know it's not going to be pretty. Brutus, he's not the kind of guy who forgives and forgets. Dante nodded slowly, processing the information. Why are you telling me this? Marco looked up, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and determination. Because I don't think what he's doing is right, and because you didn't deserve what he pulled yesterday. You stood up for those people and he can't handle that. Dante studied him for a long moment, weighing his words. Marco's discomfort seemed genuine, and there was a vulnerability in his expression that suggested he wasn't entirely on board with Brutus's actions. "You've got a choice to make," Dante said finally. "You can keep following someone who's dragging you down, or you can step away and start doing what's right." Marco swallowed hard, his gaze dropping again. "It's not that easy." "I know it's not," Dante replied, "but staying with someone like Brutus is only going to make things harder in the long run. Trust me, I've seen it before." Marco didn't respond right away, his thoughts clearly racing. Finally, he stood, brushing off his jacket. "I just wanted to warn you. You seem like a good guy, and I don't want to see you get hurt." "Thanks for the heads up," Dante said, his voice steady. "And Marco, think about what I said." Marco gave a small nod before walking away, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a heavy burden. Dante watched him go, a faint sense of hope stirring in his chest. Marco wasn't like Brutus, at least not yet. Maybe there was still time for him to change. That evening, Dante returned home to find Marco waiting on his porch, a six-pack of soda in hand. "Thought you could use some company," Marco said with a grin. Dante smiled, letting his friend inside. As they sat in the living room, Marco's expression turned serious. "So, are you going to tell me what's been on your mind?" Dante hesitated, then relayed the conversation he'd had with Marco earlier. Marco listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with each detail. "So, Brutus is planning something and one of his guys is giving you a heads up?" Marco said, leaning back in his chair. "That's unexpected." "Yeah," Dante agreed, "but it doesn't change the fact that Brutus is dangerous. If he's angry enough to try something reckless, it's not just me who could get caught in the crossfire." Marco nodded, his expression grim. "So, what's the plan?" "For now, I wait," Dante said. "Brutus will make his move eventually. When he does, I'll be ready." Marco raised an eyebrow. "You really think you can handle him and his crew?" "I don't plan on fighting them unless I have to," Dante replied. "But if it comes to that, I'll make sure it's over quickly." The two friends sat in silence for a while, the weight of the situation settling between them. Finally, Marco spoke, his tone lighter. "Well, at least you've got one thing going for you." "What's that?" Dante asked. "You're smarter than Brutus," Marco said with a smirk, "and a hell of a lot tougher." Dante chuckled, the tension easing slightly. "Let's hope that's enough." As the evening wore on, Dante found himself reflecting on Marco's warning. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than the younger man probably realized. It was a reminder that even in the midst of conflict, there was always the potential for change. And for Dante, that was reason enough to keep fighting. The next few days passed with an eerie quietness, the calm before a storm Dante knew was inevitable. Life in the neighborhood resumed its routine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Brutus and his gang were biding their time. Even Marco, usually full of jokes and bravado, seemed more subdued whenever they hung out. Dante spent his days keeping busy, running errands, helping neighbors with small tasks, and, most importantly, staying vigilant. His years in the military had honed his ability to read people and situations, and he trusted his instincts. Brutus wasn't done, and it was only a matter of time before he made his next move. It came sooner than Dante expected. It was late afternoon when Dante received a text from an unknown number. The message was brief. "Meet us in the parking lot by the old rec center. Come alone." There was no signature, but the intent was clear. Dante stared at the screen for a moment, his jaw tightening. Brutus was finally making his move. Marco, who had stopped by to drop off a toolbox, noticed the shift in Dante's expression. "What's up?" he asked. Dante showed him the message. "Looks like Brutus wants a chat." Marco frowned. "You're not seriously thinking of going, are you? It's obviously a trap." "I know," Dante said calmly. "But if I don't show, he'll escalate. Better to confront him now, on my terms. Marco shook his head. "This is a bad idea, man. At least let me come with you." "No," Dante replied firmly. "They want me alone. If you show up, it'll just make things worse." Marco sighed, clearly unhappy but unwilling to argue further. "Fine, but promise me you'll be careful." Dante nodded. "Always." The old rec center was a relic from a bygone era. Its once vibrant walls now faded and covered in graffiti. The parking lot was empty save for a row of motorcycles lined up like sentinels. As Dante approached, he spotted Brutus and his gang lounging against their bikes, their postures casual but their eyes predatory. "Right on time," Brutus said, his grin as sharp as a knife. "I like that." Dante stopped a few feet away, his stance relaxed but ready. "You wanted to talk, so talk." Brutus chuckled, pushing off his bike and sauntering closer. "Oh, I don't want to talk, soldier. I want to teach you a lesson." Dante's eyes flicked to the other bikers. Most of them looked eager, ready for whatever their leader had planned. But Marco stood at the edge of the group, his expression uneasy. Dante filed that observation away, focusing on Brutus. "You really think this is the way to handle things?" Dante asked, his tone calm but pointed. "Dragging your crew into your personal grudge." Brutus's grin faltered for a moment before he recovered. "They're with me because they know I don't take disrespect lightly. And you, soldier boy, disrespected me." Dante shook his head. "You've got this all wrong, Brutus. I wasn't trying to make you look bad. I was just standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves." "Save the speeches," Brutus snapped, his voice rising. "This isn't about them. It's about you thinking you're better than me." Dante sighed inwardly. Brutus's ego was the driving force behind all of this, and reasoning with him was like trying to douse a fire with gasoline. Still, he had to try. "Look," Dante said, spreading his hands in a gesture of peace, "we don't have to do this. Walk away now, and we can both move on." Brutus laughed, the sound hollow and mocking. "You think I'm just going to let you off the hook? Not a chance." With a snap of his fingers, Brutus signaled his crew. Two of the bikers stepped forward, their stances aggressive. Dante didn't move, his calm exterior masking the tension coiled within him. "Last chance, Brutus," Dante said quietly. "Call them off." "Make me," Brutus sneered. The bikers lunged, and Dante moved like lightning. Years of training and muscle memory took over as he sidestepped the first attacker, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. The man yelped in pain as Dante pushed him away and turned to face the second. The second biker swung wildly, but Dante ducked, delivering a quick jab to his ribs. The man staggered, clutching his side as Dante stepped back, his stance unbroken. The entire exchange had taken less than 10 seconds. The rest of the crew hesitated, their confidence shaken by how easily Dante had handled their comrades. Brutus, however, looked more furious than ever. "Is that all you've got?" Dante asked, his voice calm but edged with challenge. Brutus's face twisted with rage. He pulled a knife from his belt, the blade gleaming in the fading sunlight. "You think you're tough? Let's see how tough you are now." Dante's eyes narrowed, his focus sharpening. "Put it down, Brutus. This doesn't have to go any further." "Oh, it's going further," Brutus growled, advancing. Before he could strike, Marco stepped between them, his hands raised. "Brutus, stop. This isn't worth it." "Move, Marco," Brutus snapped. "You're either with me or against me." Marco hesitated, his gaze darting between Brutus and Dante. Finally, he stepped aside, his shoulders slumping. Dante noted the internal conflict on his face, but there was no time to dwell on it. Brutus lunged, and Dante sidestepped, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground as Brutus let out a pained grunt. Dante released him and kicked the blade away, stepping back. "That's enough," Dante said firmly. "It's over." Brutus stumbled back, clutching his wrist and glaring at Dante. "This isn't over," he spat. "You'll regret this." Dante didn't respond, his steady gaze holding Brutus's until the man finally turned and stalked toward his bike. The rest of the gang followed, their earlier bravado replaced with uncertainty. Marco was the last to leave, casting Dante a look that was equal parts apology and gratitude. As the roar of motorcycles faded into the distance, Dante exhaled, the tension draining from his body. He knew Brutus would come back, angrier and more dangerous than ever. But for now, he had bought himself some time, and perhaps planted a seed of doubt in at least one of Brutus's men. Dante turned and walked away, his mind already racing with what he needed to do next. The next morning dawned with a clarity that belied the storm brewing beneath the surface. Dante awoke early, his body already primed for action, a habit forged through years of military discipline. He knew Brutus wouldn't let their last encounter be the end of it, and the key to staying ahead would be maintaining control of himself, the situation, and any escalation that might come. After a quick workout, Dante brewed a pot of coffee and sat at his small kitchen table, going over the events of the previous day in his mind. Brutus's anger was palpable, but Dante had seen something else in the gang leader's eyes: frustration. Brutus thrived on power dynamics, using intimidation to maintain control. The fact that Dante had not only stood his ground but dismantled Brutus's attempts at dominance had shaken the man more than he would admit. The knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Marco stood on the porch, a bag of breakfast sandwiches in one hand and a concerned look on his face. "I figured you could use some reinforcements," Marco said as he stepped inside. Dante chuckled, taking the bag and setting it on the table. "You're not wrong." As they ate, Dante filled Marco in on the details of his meeting with Brutus. Marco listened intently, his expression shifting between worry and disbelief. "So, he actually pulled a knife on you?" Marco asked, shaking his head. "The guy's unhinged." "He's desperate," Dante corrected, "and that makes him dangerous. But he's also predictable. He's not thinking clearly, which gives me the advantage." Marco leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "What's the plan, then? You're not just going to wait around for him to make his next move, are you?" "Not exactly," Dante said. "I've been thinking about this from every angle. Brutus wants to fight me, but he also wants an audience. He needs people to see him win, so he can regain his control over the group." Marco frowned. "And you're planning to give him that audience?" Dante nodded. "If I don't, he'll keep coming after me, and he won't care who gets caught in the crossfire. This way, I can control the situation, minimize the risk to everyone else." Marco sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know this is crazy, right?" "Maybe," Dante admitted, "but it's the best option I've got." By midday, word had spread through the neighborhood about the tension between Dante and Brutus. A few neighbors stopped by, offering words of support and cautious warnings. Among them was Sarah, who brought a thermos of iced tea and a concerned smile. "I heard what happened," she said as she handed him the drink. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Dante assured her, "just trying to stay ahead of things." Sarah hesitated, her brow furrowing. "You're not planning to take him on, are you?" "It's not about wanting to fight," Dante said. "It's about keeping him from hurting anyone else." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Just be careful, okay? People around here are starting to look up to you. We need someone like you." Her words stayed with Dante long after she left, a reminder of why he couldn't afford to let Brutus dictate the terms. This wasn't just about him, it was about the community, and if he was going to stop Brutus, he needed to do it decisively and without unnecessary violence. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dante received another text. This one was less cryptic. "Tomorrow, 8 p.m., the old warehouse on 5th. Don't be late." Dante's lips tightened into a grim line. The location made sense. The warehouse was isolated, its abandoned structure a perfect setting for the confrontation Brutus was orchestrating. It was also a space where things could spiral out of control if Dante wasn't careful. He spent the rest of the night preparing. Not with weapons or armor, this wasn't a military mission, but by reviewing his plan. Every step, every move had to be calculated. Brutus would come with his gang, likely armed with their own makeshift weapons. But Dante had something Brutus didn't: discipline, training, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. The next day passed in a blur. Dante kept himself busy, checking in on neighbors and helping Marco with some repairs at the community center. It was a welcome distraction, though the anticipation of what was to come lingered at the edges of his mind. As the clock ticked closer to 8 p.m., Dante dressed in simple, functional clothes, jeans, a plain t-shirt, and sturdy boots. He didn't need anything fancy. His skill would do the talking. Before leaving, he took a moment to steady his breathing, centering himself. "You've got this," he murmured to himself. "Stay in control." The warehouse loomed in the twilight, its broken windows and rusted exterior casting eerie shadows. As Dante approached, he saw the bikers gathered near the entrance, their silhouettes stark against the fading light. Brutus stood at the center, his broad frame impossible to miss. "Well, look who showed up," Brutus called as Dante stepped into the circle of flickering light from a nearby street lamp. "I was starting to think you'd chicken out." "Not my style," Dante replied, his voice calm. Brutus smirked, cracking his knuckles. "Good. Then let's settle this once and for all." Dante held up a hand. "Before we do, let's make one thing clear. This isn't about your crew, and it's not about anyone else. It's between you and me." Brutus hesitated, his bravado faltering for a split second. "What are you getting at?" "I'm giving you a chance to back down," Dante said. "Walk away now, and we both save ourselves a lot of trouble." The bikers murmured among themselves, their uncertainty palpable. Brutus glared at Dante, his ego warring with the seeds of doubt Dante had planted. "You think you're better than me?" Brutus growled. "You don't get to come into my territory and act like you run the show." "This isn't about being better," Dante said. "It's about doing what's right." The tension crackled in the air as Brutus clenched his fists, his decision teetering on the edge. Dante stood his ground, his steady gaze locked on Brutus, radiating a confidence that was impossible to ignore. Whatever happened next, Dante knew one thing for certain: he was in control. The warehouse was eerily silent except for the faint creak of rusted metal in the evening breeze. Dante stood still, his expression calm but his mind sharp, analyzing every detail of the scene before him. Brutus and his gang encircled him like predators sizing up prey. Their postures were tense, their movements deliberate, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty in their eyes. They had seen Dante's skill, and it lingered in the back of their minds like a shadow. Brutus stepped forward, his bulk imposing under the dim glow of the street lamp. He cracked his knuckles and sneered. "You had your chance to walk away, soldier. Now you're going to pay for making me look like a fool." Dante met his gaze, unflinching. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will, Brutus." Brutus laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Oh, I think it'll end just fine. You ready to get what's coming to you?" The gang closed ranks, their leather jackets rustling as they shifted into position. A couple of them brandished makeshift weapons, chains, bats, and one with a crowbar. Dante took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had no intention of letting this escalate to unnecessary violence, but he was prepared to do what was needed to protect himself. "Last warning," Dante said, his voice low and firm. "Walk away." Brutus's grin widened. Not a chance. With a guttural roar, Brutus lunged at Dante, his fists swinging with raw, untrained aggression. Dante sidestepped easily, pivoting on his heel and delivering a sharp strike to Brutus's ribs. The gang leader staggered but recovered quickly, his face twisting in anger. "Get him!" Brutus barked, and the gang surged forward. Dante's training kicked in like a well-oiled machine. He moved with precision and efficiency, ducking and weaving between the attackers. The first biker swung a chain at him, but Dante caught it mid-swing, yanking the man off balance before disarming him with a sharp twist of the wrist. A swift kick to the chest sent the biker sprawling to the ground. The next attacker came at him with a bat, aiming for Dante's ribs. Dante stepped into the swing, grabbing the biker's arm and twisting it behind his back. With a controlled shove, he sent the man stumbling into another gang member, both of them crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The fight was chaos, but Dante remained calm, his movements fluid and deliberate. He wasn't fighting to hurt them, just to neutralize the threat. A jab to the solar plexus here, a sweep of the legs there. Each move was calculated to disable his opponents without causing permanent damage. As more bikers fell, the gang's confidence began to waver. They had underestimated him, and now they were paying the price. Even Marco, standing at the edge of the fray, looked conflicted, his eyes darting between Dante and his fallen comrades. "Pathetic!" Brutus snarled, glaring at his crew. "Is this what I have to work with?" He charged at Dante again, this time with a crowbar in hand. The weapon whistled through the air as Brutus swung with all his strength. Dante ducked, the crowbar missing him by inches, and countered with a sharp elbow to Brutus's shoulder. The gang leader grunted in pain but didn't back down, his pride driving him forward. The two circled each other, Brutus's heavy breaths echoing in the empty warehouse. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" he spat. "You think you can just walk in here and take me down?" "It's not about being better," Dante said, his voice calm but firm. "It's about knowing when to stop." Brutus roared and swung again, but his movements were sloppy, driven by anger rather than strategy. Dante sidestepped and swept Brutus's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. The crowbar clattered away, leaving Brutus unarmed and vulnerable. Dante stepped back, giving him space to stand. "It's over, Brutus. Call it off." Brutus glared up at him, his face red with rage and humiliation. For a moment it looked like he might charge again, but the weight of his defeat finally sank in. He slumped back, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. The rest of the gang hesitated, their confidence shattered. One by one they dropped their weapons and backed away, avoiding Dante's gaze. Only Marco remained, his expression a mixture of relief and shame. Dante turned to him. "It's not too late to make a different choice, Marco." Marco nodded slowly, the words sinking in. "I know." The silence was heavy as the gang retreated, leaving Brutus alone on the warehouse floor. He glared at Dante, his voice a venomous whisper. "This isn't over." Dante met his gaze, unflinching. "It is, if you let it be." With that, Dante turned and walked away, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. He knew Brutus might try again, but for now, the fight was over. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had stayed in control, just as he'd planned. And though the road ahead would still be rocky, Dante knew he had made the right choice. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Dante's small living room, casting slanted lines across the floor. He sat on the couch, sipping a cup of coffee, his body still buzzing from the events of the previous night. The fight had been necessary, but it had taken its toll. The aches in his muscles were a reminder that even a well-executed plan came with a price. Marco barged through the door without knocking, his face a mixture of relief and exasperation. "You're alive," he declared, dropping a brown bag of pastries on the table. "I was half expecting to find you in a hospital bed." "Good morning to you, too," Dante replied, setting his coffee down. "And yes, I'm fine. A little sore, but nothing I can't handle." Marco plopped down in a chair, shaking his head. "I don't get it. You take on Brutus and his entire crew, and you're acting like it was just another day at the office." "That's because it was," Dante said with a faint smile. "I've dealt with worse." Marco gave him a long look, then leaned forward, his tone serious. "So, what happens now? Do you think he'll actually back off?" Dante sighed, leaning back against the couch. Hard to say. Brutus doesn't strike me as the kind of guy who knows when to quit, but last night shook his confidence. If he's smart, he'll think twice before coming after me again. And if he's not smart, Marco asked, then I'll deal with it, Dante said simply. Later that day, Dante went about his routine, stopping by the community center to help with repairs and checking in on a few neighbors. Everywhere he went, people seemed to know what had happened. Word of the confrontation had spread quickly, and while most of the details were exaggerated, the core of the story remained the same. Dante had stood up to Brutus and won. At the grocery store, a young mother approached him, her toddler in tow. "Thank you for what you did," she said, her voice earnest. "I heard about the fight. You're braver than most of us." Dante nodded, offering a polite smile. Just doing what needed to be done. The woman hesitated, then added, "It's good to know there's someone looking out for the rest of us." Her words stayed with Dante as he left the store, a weight settling on his shoulders. He hadn't set out to become a symbol of hope for the community, but it seemed the role had found him regardless. That evening, as Dante walked back to his house, he noticed a figure sitting on his front steps. It was Marco, his posture hunched and his hands fidgeting in his lap. The younger man looked up as Dante approached, his expression a mixture of guilt and determination. "Didn't expect to see you here," Dante said, stopping a few feet away. Marco stood, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "I needed to talk to you. About last night." Dante raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" Marco took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the ground. "You were right. About Brutus, about all of it. I've been following him for years, thinking he had all the answers. But last night, seeing how easily you took us down, it made me realize how wrong I've been." Dante crossed his arms, studying the younger man. "What do you want from me, Marco?" "I don't know," Marco admitted. "Maybe advice, a fresh start. All I know is I can't keep doing this. Not after everything." Dante was silent for a moment, then motioned toward the steps. "Sit." Marco hesitated, then sat back down, his shoulders slumping. Dante joined him, the two men staring out at the quiet street. "You've already taken the first step," Dante said finally. "Admitting you want to change is the hardest part. Now it's about following through." Marco nodded slowly. "How?" "By deciding what kind of person you want to be," Dante replied, "and by making choices that align with that. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's worth it." Marco looked at him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "You really think I can turn things around?" Dante met his gaze, his voice steady. "I know you can." The next few days were quieter, but the tension in the air remained. Brutus and his gang had retreated into the shadows, their absence as unnerving as their presence had been. Dante knew they weren't gone for good, but the reprieve gave him time to reflect and to plan. The community, meanwhile, began to rally around him in small but meaningful ways. Neighbors offered him meals, thanked him in passing, and even helped with yard work. It was clear that his actions had inspired a sense of unity among them, a silver lining in the midst of the conflict. Sarah stopped by one afternoon, carrying a basket of fresh-baked cookies. She smiled as she handed them over, her eyes warm. For the neighborhood hero. Dante chuckled, accepting the basket. "I wouldn't go that far." "Well, I would," she said. "You've done more for this place in a few weeks than most people do in years." Her words humbled him, but they also reminded him of the responsibility he now carried. Whether he liked it or not, people were looking to him for guidance, for strength. As the sun set that evening, Dante sat on his porch, the basket of cookies beside him. The street was quiet, the shadows long and soft. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, but for now, he had the upper hand. And with the support of the community behind him, He knew he wasn't facing it alone. The night was still, save for the faint hum of motorcycles echoing in the distance. At a roadside bar on the outskirts of town, Brutus nursed a glass of whiskey, his expression dark and brooding. Around him, his gang sat in subdued silence, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of their recent defeat. The humiliation of the warehouse fight lingered, festering like an open wound, and Brutus's ego burned with the need to reclaim his dominance. He slammed the glass down on the bar, startling the others. "We can't let him get away with this," he growled. "That soldier thinks he can waltz into my territory and make a fool of me?" The bikers exchanged uneasy glances but remained silent. None of them had forgotten how easily Dante had dismantled their assault. Even the bravest among them harbored doubts about challenging him again. Marco's absence hadn't gone unnoticed either, and though no one spoke of it openly, they all knew it was a bad sign. Brutus turned to his right-hand man, a wiry, sharp-featured biker named Vince. "We need a plan, something big, something that'll remind everyone who's in charge." Vince hesitated, clearly weighing his words. "Look, Brutus, I get it. What happened at the warehouse was bad, but maybe we should let this one go. That guy isn't normal. He's military trained. We go after him again, and we're asking for more trouble." Brutus's face twisted in anger. "Let it go? Are you serious? If we back down now, we lose everything. Respect, power, everything. You want to live in fear of him for the rest of your life?" Vince didn't reply, but his silence was enough to fuel Brutus's fury. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the bar. "We'll hit him where it hurts. Find out what he cares about, his friends, his neighbors, and make him regret ever crossing me." The gang murmured uneasily, but no one dared challenge him directly. Brutus turned to another biker, a burly man named Tank. "Get me everything you can on him, where he goes, who he talks to, what he does. I want to know his every move." Tank nodded reluctantly, his discomfort clear. "You got it, boss." As the days passed, Brutus's obsession with revenge grew. He pored over the information Tank and the others gathered, piecing together fragments of Dante's life. The soldier was disciplined, careful, and well-liked by the community. Traits that only made Brutus hate him more. The neighbors who rallied around Dante added another layer of irritation. They were loyal to him, and Brutus saw their support as a personal insult. One night, Brutus sat alone in the gang's hideout, a grimy warehouse filled with the acrid smell of oil and sweat. He sifted through a stack of photos Tank had taken. One showed Dante helping an older man repair a fence. Another captured him chatting with a group of kids outside the community center. But it was the last photo that made Brutus pause. It was of Dante and Sarah, walking side by side down a quiet street. Her smile was bright, and his expression was relaxed in a way that Brutus found infuriating. The sight of them together sparked an idea in his mind, one that brought a cruel smile to his lips. "If he wants to play hero," Brutus muttered, "let's see how far he's willing to go." Meanwhile, at the community center, Dante was oblivious to Brutus's schemes. He was helping Sarah and Marco organize a charity event, their laughter filling the air as they set up tables and chairs. For the first time in weeks, things felt normal. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood was easing, and Dante allowed himself to hope that the worst was behind them. "You're a natural at this," Sarah teased as Dante struggled to tie a balloon arch to a pole. Who knew the big, tough soldier had a knack for decorating? "Don't let this fool you," Marco chimed in, grinning. "I've seen his idea of decorating. It's called bare walls and one chair." Dante smirked, shaking his head. "I'll take that as a compliment." As they worked, Sarah caught Dante's eye, her expression turning serious. "You've done a lot for this community, you know. People really look up to you." "I'm just doing what anyone else would do," Dante said, though her words warmed him. "Not everyone would," Sarah replied. "That's what makes you different." Dante didn't have time to respond. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he checked the screen, a cold knot formed in his stomach. The message was short and unsigned. You can't protect everyone. TikTok. His expression darkened as he showed the message to Marco and Sarah. Brutus, he said simply. Marco's face hardened. What's his deal? He loses, and now he's trying to scare you. Sarah frowned, her brow furrowed with worry. What does he mean by, you can't protect everyone? Dante clenched his jaw, his mind racing. Brutus was trying to bait him, but the message was also a threat. It wasn't just about him anymore. Brutus was targeting the people Dante cared about. That night, Dante sat alone on his porch, staring out at the quiet street. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, heavier than ever. He had thought the fight at the warehouse would end things, but it had only escalated the conflict. Brutus wasn't just a bully. He was dangerous, and now he was going after more than just Dante. Dante's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. He looked up to see Marco standing at the edge of the porch, his expression cautious. Mind if I sit? Marco asked. Dante gestured for him to join. What's on your mind? Marco hesitated, then spoke. Brutus is planning something. I don't know all the details, but he's been talking about going after people close to you. He's trying to get under your skin. Dante nodded, his suspicions confirmed. Thanks for the warning. Marco shifted uncomfortably. I know I've been part of his crew for a long time, but I don't want to be part of this anymore. I want out. Dante studied him for a moment, then said, You've already made the hardest decision, choosing to leave. Now it's about following through. Marco nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. I'll do whatever I can to help. Just tell me what you need. As Marco left, Dante sat in the quiet once more, his resolve hardening. Brutus had declared war, but Dante wasn't going to let him win. He would protect the people he cared about, no matter what it took. The morning sun bathed the neighborhood in golden light, casting long, soft shadows on the quiet streets. For the first time in weeks, Dante allowed himself a rare indulgence, a day off. After everything that had happened, he realized he needed a moment to recharge. Brutus was still a threat, but Dante couldn't let the tension consume him. To stay sharp, he needed balance. He started the day with a long run through the park, his steady pace carrying him past families setting up for picnics and children laughing on the playground. The rhythmic sound of his breathing and the crunch of gravel under his shoes helped clear his mind. By the time he returned home, sweat-drenched and muscles pleasantly sore, the weight of his worries felt a little lighter. Later, as Dante sat on his porch sipping a protein shake, Marco strolled up, carrying a basketball under one arm and grinning like a kid with a secret. Guess what? Marco said, dropping into the chair beside him. Dante raised an eyebrow. You won the lottery? Better, Marco replied, spinning the basketball on his finger. Pickup game at the community center. You, me, and a couple of the guys. Loser buys lunch. Dante chuckled. And by loser, you mean you? Bold words, my friend, Marco said with a mock glare. Let's see if those skills of yours extend beyond kicking butt. Dante shook his head, smiling despite himself. A basketball game sounded like exactly what he needed. The community center gym was alive with the echoes of bouncing basketballs and laughter. Marco had rounded up a mix of players, neighbors, a few teens from the neighborhood, and even Sarah, who showed up in a pair of sneakers and a confident grin. You're playing too? Dante asked as she tied her hair into a ponytail. Don't look so surprised, Sarah shot back. I'll have you know I was the captain of my high school team. Great, Marco muttered, as if Dante wasn't enough of a challenge. The game began with a friendly tip-off, the ball soaring into the air and the players scattering. Despite their initial bravado, it became clear that Marco and Sarah were the real competitors. Marco had speed and tenacity, while Sarah had precision and strategy. Dante, on the other hand, played with calm efficiency, weaving through defenders and landing shots with practiced ease. The game was fast-paced and filled with good-natured trash talk. Marco groaned every time Sarah outmaneuvered him, and the teens on Marco's team cheered whenever Dante sank a three-pointer. The gym echoed with the sounds of sneakers squeaking against the floor and the rhythmic thump of the ball. At one point, Marco called for a timeout, panting as he leaned against the wall. "All right, I'll admit it. You're good," he said to Dante. "Thanks," Dante replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "You're not bad yourself." "I meant Sarah," Marco added with a grin. "She's destroying us." Sarah laughed, tossing Marco a water bottle. "Guess you should have picked better teammates." By the end of the game, Sarah's team emerged victorious, and Marco grudgingly handed over a $20 bill for lunch. They all piled into a local diner afterward, the table crowded with plates of burgers, fries, and milkshakes. The atmosphere was light, filled with stories and laughter that reminded Dante of what he had been missing since leaving the military. As they ate, Dante noticed how easily Sarah fit into the group. She had a natural charisma that drew people in, and her quick wit kept everyone engaged. It was refreshing, and Dante found himself smiling more than he had in weeks. "So, what's next for the neighborhood hero?" Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow at Dante as she sipped her milkshake. He shrugged, playing it cool. "Probably back to fixing fences and scaring off troublemakers." Sarah smirked. "Humble as always." Marco leaned in, his tone teasing. "You know, if this whole handyman/hero thing doesn't work out, you could always try professional basketball." "I'll keep that in mind," Dante replied with a grin. That afternoon, Dante decided to visit the local farmer's market. The air was filled with the scent of fresh produce and baked goods, and the chatter of vendors created a pleasant hum. As he wandered through the stalls, he found himself drawn to a table selling handmade wooden carvings. The elderly craftsman behind the table greeted him warmly. "Anything catch your eye?" the man asked. Dante picked up a small carving of a wolf, its details finely etched. "This is incredible work." "Thank you," the man said, smiling. "The wolf symbolizes strength and loyalty. It suits you." Dante raised an eyebrow. "How do you know it suits me?" "Call it an old man's intuition," the craftsman replied with a wink. "Take it. Consider it a gift." Dante tried to protest, but the man waved him off. "Just promise me you'll keep being the kind of person who deserves it." Touched by the gesture, Dante accepted the carving and slipped it into his pocket. As he walked away, he felt a sense of quiet gratitude. The day had been filled with small, meaningful moments, proof that life didn't always have to be about conflict. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dante sat on his porch with the wolf carving in his hand. The neighborhood was quiet, the air cool and still. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. He knew the road ahead would still be difficult. Brutus was out there, plotting his next move, and the community's newfound unity was fragile. But for now, Dante allowed himself to simply be present, to enjoy the calm before whatever storm might come next. As he placed the carving on the porch railing, he made a silent vow. No matter what happened, he would protect the people who had come to rely on him. Because strength wasn't just about winning fights, it was about standing firm in the face of adversity and choosing to do what was right. The next morning, the sense of peace Dante had felt the day before evaporated as soon as he woke. The text message from Brutus still lingered in his mind, its threatening tone a constant reminder of the storm that had yet to break. He went through his morning routine with purpose, knowing that vigilance was now more important than ever. Marco stopped by around noon, a bag of groceries in one hand and a worried look on his face. "Any news on Brutus?" he asked as he set the bag on the counter. "Nothing yet," Dante replied, stirring a pot of coffee. "But I'm keeping my ears open." Marco nodded, his expression grim. "I don't like this quiet. It feels wrong." "It's how people like Brutus operate," Dante said. "They want you to let your guard down." Marco sighed, running a hand through his hair. What's the plan, then? We just wait? Dante handed him a cup of coffee. For now, yes, but if he makes a move, I'll be ready. The day passed uneventfully, but Dante's instincts told him that something was brewing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, he received a call from Sarah. Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of concern. "Hey, Dante, have you heard from Marco? He said he was going to meet some friends at the diner, but he's not answering his phone." Dante frowned. "No, I haven't. When was the last time you heard from him?" "About an hour ago," Sarah said. "He mentioned something about a late lunch, but now I'm worried." Dante's gut tightened. "I'll check it out." Grabbing his keys, Dante headed for the diner. The streets were quiet, the soft hum of streetlights the only sound as he drove. When he arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty, save for Marco's car parked in the far corner. A sense of unease settled over him as he stepped out of his truck. Inside, the diner was dimly lit, the faint smell of coffee and grease lingering in the air. The tables were empty, and the waitress behind the counter glanced up with mild surprise. "Evening," she said. "You looking for someone?" "My friend Marco," Dante replied. "He said he'd be here." The waitress frowned. "He was here earlier, but he left about 20 minutes ago. Looked like he was heading toward the back lot." Dante's jaw tightened. "Thanks." He exited the diner and walked around to the back where a small, dimly lit lot stretched out into the night. As he stepped into the open space, a sudden rustling sound caught his attention. He turned, his senses on high alert, just as Brutus and two of his men stepped out of the shadows. "Well, well," Brutus drawled, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Look who decided to show up." Dante's eyes scanned the scene quickly. Marco was nowhere in sight, but the tension in the air told him this wasn't just a coincidence. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. Brutus feigned innocence, spreading his hands. "Relax, soldier. Your buddy's fine, for now. We just wanted to have a little chat." Dante took a step closer, his body language unyielding. "If you've hurt him—" "Easy," Brutus interrupted. "We didn't touch him. But if you don't start playing nice, that could change." Dante's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay composed. Brutus wanted him to lose control, to act impulsively. Instead, Dante focused on gathering information. "What do you want?" Brutus smirked. "What I've wanted all along. Respect. You humiliated me, and now you're going to fix it." "And how exactly do you expect me to do that?" Dante asked. "You're going to disappear," Brutus said, his tone dripping with menace. "Leave this town, leave your friends and never come back. Do that, and maybe I'll let them off the hook." Dante shook his head. "You think that's going to work? You think I'd trust you to keep your word?" Brutus's grin faltered for a moment before he recovered. "You don't have much of a choice, soldier." Dante's gaze flicked to the two men flanking Brutus. They were tense, their stances uncertain. Even Brutus's bravado seemed more forced than genuine. The cracks in their unity were starting to show. "I have a choice," Dante said, his voice steady. "And so do you. You can keep this up, keep dragging your crew down with you, or you can let it go and walk away." Brutus's face twisted in anger. "You don't get to lecture me." Before Brutus could act, Dante lunged, moving with calculated precision. He swept the legs out from under one of the bikers, sending him crashing to the ground. The second swung at Dante with a crowbar, but Dante ducked and delivered a sharp jab to his ribs, disarming him in one swift motion. Brutus charged, but Dante sidestepped, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. Brutus let out a guttural roar as Dante shoved him forward, sending him stumbling. "It's over," Dante said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Walk away while you still can." Brutus glared at him, his chest heaving. For a moment it seemed like he might attack again, but then he spat on the ground and turned away. "This isn't over," he growled, motioning for his men to follow. Dante watched them retreat into the night, his body still tense. As soon as they were out of sight, he called Sarah. "I found Marco's car, but not him," he said. "Call me if you hear anything." "Be careful," Sarah replied, her worry evident. As Dante stood alone in the empty lot, the weight of the situation settled over him. Brutus wasn't just a threat anymore, he was escalating, and Dante knew the fight was far from over. The tension in the air was palpable as Dante pulled into his driveway early the next morning. The confrontation with Brutus still played on a loop in his mind, and the mystery of Marco's whereabouts added to the weight on his shoulders. Despite his best efforts to stay ahead of Brutus's schemes, it was clear the gang leader was becoming more reckless and desperate. Dante sat in his truck for a moment, running a hand over his face. He needed to regroup, to figure out his next move before Brutus escalated even further. Just as he was about to head inside, Sarah's car pulled up to the curb. She got out quickly, her face pale with worry. "Any word on Marco?" she asked, skipping pleasantries. "Not yet," Dante replied, stepping out of his truck. "But I'm not giving up." Sarah nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "This isn't like him. He wouldn't just disappear." Dante placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll find him. I promise." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. Finding none, she exhaled and nodded again. "Okay, so what's the plan?" The two of them spent the next few hours reaching out to mutual friends and acquaintances, trying to piece together Marco's last known movements. They learned that he had left the diner parking lot shortly before Dante arrived, following a call from an unknown number. No one had seen or heard from him since. As the day wore on, Dante began to notice a subtle but important shift in the people around him. Sarah, always quick to act and full of determination, had become his closest ally, her sharp instincts complementing his disciplined approach. Meanwhile, others in the community were starting to step forward, offering their support in small but meaningful ways. One such moment came when a group of neighborhood teens approached Dante outside the community center. Among them was Javier, Sarah's younger brother, a wiry kid with an attitude that belied his age. "Hey, Dante," Javier said, shifting nervously. We heard about what's going on. With Brutus." Dante raised an eyebrow. "And?" Javier glanced at his friends, then back at Dante. "We want to help." The other teens nodded, their faces a mixture of determination and apprehension. Dante crossed his arms, studying them carefully. "Help how?" "Just, keep an eye out," Javier said quickly. "If we see anything suspicious, we'll tell you. We can't just sit around doing nothing." Dante's stern expression softened slightly. He could see the earnestness in their eyes, the desire to stand up for their community. It reminded him of why he had chosen this fight in the first place. "All right," he said, "but no heroics. If you see something, you tell me or Sarah. Don't engage. Got it?" Javier grinned. "Got it." As the teens left, Sarah walked over, having overheard the conversation. "You've got fans," she said with a smirk. "More like recruits," Dante replied. "They've got good intentions, but I don't want them getting hurt." "Neither do I," Sarah said, her tone serious. "But it's kind of amazing, isn't it? How people are stepping up because of you." Dante shrugged. "I'm just doing what anyone else would do." "Not anyone," Sarah countered. "You've given them hope, Dante. That's not nothing." Her words stayed with him as they continued their search for Marco. They followed every lead, combed through every rumor, but by nightfall they were no closer to finding him. Exhausted but determined, Dante knew he needed to take a different approach. The next day, Dante decided to confront Marco. The former gang member had been lying low since the ambush, but Dante had a feeling he knew more than he was letting on. After some asking around, he found Marco working at a gas station on the edge of town. Marco looked up in surprise as Dante walked in. "Dante," he said, his voice wary, "what are you doing here?" "We need to talk," Dante said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Marco glanced around nervously, then nodded. "All right, let's step outside." Once they were out back, Dante got straight to the point. "Brutus is escalating. He's targeting people close to me and Marco's missing. What do you know?" Marco's expression shifted to guilt and he avoided Dante's gaze. "Look, I didn't want to get involved, but Brutus, he's out of control. He's been talking about teaching you a lesson by going after the people you care about." "Where's Marco?" Dante pressed, his voice firm but not unkind. "I don't know," Marco admitted, "but I heard Brutus mention the old lumber yard. It's been abandoned for years. If he's holding Marco somewhere, that's where he'd do it." Dante's jaw tightened. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I was scared," Marco said quietly, "but I don't want to be part of this anymore. Brutus isn't just dangerous, he's lost it." Dante studied him for a moment, then nodded. "If you want out, now's your chance. But if you know anything else, you tell me. Understood?" "Understood," Marco said, relief flickering in his eyes. That evening, Dante and Sarah sat on his porch going over their plan to check out the lumber yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, but neither of them paid it any mind. Their focus was on Marco, and stopping Brutus before he could do any more damage. "You really think he'll be there?" Sarah asked. Dante nodded. "It's our best lead. Brutus thinks he's untouchable, but he's sloppy. If we move fast, we can catch him off guard." Sarah hesitated, then said, "You don't have to do this alone, you know." "I'm not alone," Dante replied, meeting her gaze. "I've got you, and that makes all the difference." As the first stars appeared in the sky, Dante felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, but with allies like Sarah and the community behind him, he knew they had a fighting chance. The old lumberyard was shrouded in darkness, its abandoned buildings looming like silent sentinels against the night sky. Dante crouched behind a stack of rusted steel barrels, his keen eyes scanning the area for signs of movement. Beside him, Sarah waited, her expression tense but resolute. They had driven here under cover of night, determined to find Marco and put an end to Brutus's escalating threats. From their vantage point, they could see a dim light spilling from one of the larger buildings. Shadows moved inside, and the faint hum of voices carried on the still air. "Looks like they're all here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Dante nodded. "Stay close. If things get messy, get out and call for help." Sarah gave him a look. "I'm not leaving you." "You might not have a choice," Dante replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Reluctantly, Sarah nodded, and they began to move, staying low as they approached the building. The closer they got, the clearer the voices became, punctuated by Brutus's unmistakable growl. Inside the lumber yard, Brutus paced in front of his crew, his temper simmering just beneath the surface. Marco sat tied to a chair in the center of the room, his face bruised but defiant. Despite his predicament, he glared at Brutus with unyielding defiance. "You think this is going to scare him?" Marco spat. "Dante's not afraid of you." Brutus snarled, slamming a fist onto the table. "He will be. Once he realizes I've got you, he'll come running, and then we'll finish this." Around him, the gang members shifted uneasily. The events of the past few weeks had taken a toll on their morale, and Dante's effortless dismantling of their previous attacks had planted seeds of doubt. Marco's departure and Brutus's increasingly erratic behavior only widened the cracks in their unity. "Brutus, maybe we should rethink this," Vince said, his tone hesitant. "That guy's no joke. He's military. He knows what he's doing." Brutus rounded on him, his eyes blazing. "You scared, Vince? Because if you are, there's the door." Vince clenched his jaw, saying nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Others in the gang exchanged wary glances, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. From outside, Dante and Sarah watched the exchange through a cracked window. Dante's sharp eyes took in every detail: the placement of the gang members, the weapons scattered on the table, the strained expressions on their faces. He could see the fractures forming among them, and he knew it was a weakness he could exploit. "Stay here," Dante whispered to Sarah. "I'm going in." "What?" she hissed. "You can't take them all on by yourself." "I won't have to," Dante said, his voice calm. "They're already falling apart. I just need to push them a little further." Before Sarah could argue, Dante slipped through the side door, moving with the silent precision of a predator. He stayed in the shadows, positioning himself behind a stack of crates near the center of the room. From here, he could see everything: the gang, Brutus, and Marco, who looked battered but otherwise unharmed. Brutus was still ranting, his voice growing louder with each passing moment. "We stick together, we win. That's how this works. But if any of you are thinking about bailing, you'd better think twice." Dante stepped forward, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "Sounds like you've already lost them, Brutus." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Dante. He stood tall and calm, his presence commanding. Brutus's face twisted with rage, but several of the bikers looked visibly shaken. "You've got some nerve showing up here," Brutus snarled. "You made it easy," Dante replied. "All that noise you're making, it's hard to miss." Brutus took a step forward, but Dante held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Before you do something you'll regret, maybe you should take a look around. Your crew doesn't look so sure about you anymore." The gang members shifted uncomfortably, their loyalty to Brutus wavering under Dante's pointed words. Vince, in particular, avoided Brutus's gaze, his earlier doubts written all over his face. "Shut up," Brutus growled. "They're with me." "Are they?" Dante asked, his tone calm but cutting. "Or are they just too scared to leave?" Brutus turned to his crew, his expression a mix of anger and desperation. "You're with me, right?" No one answered. The silence was deafening, and Brutus's face darkened with realization. "You don't have to follow him anymore," Dante said, addressing the gang. "You've seen what kind of leader he is, reckless, selfish, and willing to drag you all down with him. You've got a choice. Walk away now and you can start fresh, or stay and go down with him." Vince was the first to move. He stepped back, dropping the chain he'd been holding. "I'm out," he said, his voice steady. One by one, the other gang members followed suit, their weapons clattering to the floor as they turned and walked toward the door. Brutus watched in disbelief, his fists clenching at his sides. "Cowards!" he shouted after them. "You'll regret this." When the last of the gang had left, Brutus turned back to Dante, his face twisted with fury. "This isn't over." "It is for them," Dante said, "and it can be for you too, if you let it." Brutus lunged, but Dante was ready. He sidestepped the attack, using Brutus's momentum to throw him off balance. A quick sweep of the leg sent Brutus crashing to the ground, and Dante pressed a knee into his back, pinning him. "It's over," Dante said firmly. "Let it go." Brutus struggled for a moment, then went still, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Dante stood, stepping back to give him space. For a moment, Brutus looked like he might lash out again, but then his shoulders slumped, and he stayed on the ground. Dante turned to Marco, untying him quickly. "You okay?" "Been better," Marco replied, rubbing his wrists. "But I'm glad you showed up." As they left the lumberyard, the first hints of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The night had been long and difficult, but Dante felt a sense of accomplishment. The gang had fractured, and Brutus was no longer the threat he once was. There was still work to be done, but for the first time in weeks, Dante allowed himself to feel hopeful. The morning after the confrontation at the lumberyard, Dante woke to a rare sense of calm. The streets outside were quiet, the sun casting a warm glow on the neighborhood. For the first time in weeks, the tension that had gripped the community seemed to ease. The gang had fractured, and Brutus was effectively neutralized. For now. As Dante stepped outside to retrieve the morning paper, he noticed something unusual. A small group of neighbors gathered at the edge of his driveway. Marco, Sarah, and even Javier were among them, along with others from the neighborhood. "What's going on?" Dante asked, folding the paper under his arm. Marco stepped forward, a sheepish grin on his face. "We, figured it was time we stepped up. You've been doing a lot for this community, and we thought maybe it was time to return the favor." Dante raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "We're here to help," Sarah said, stepping beside Marco. "The community's been through a lot lately, and we realized we can't just sit back and let you handle everything. So, we're organizing." Javier, holding a clipboard with a list of names, chimed in. "Yeah, we're starting a neighborhood watch. People are signing up to keep an eye out for trouble and help each other out." Dante blinked, genuinely surprised. The idea of a community coming together to take care of itself was exactly what he'd been fighting for, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon, or so spontaneously. "That's great," Dante said, his voice tinged with pride. "You sure you're ready for this?" Sarah smiled. "We're ready. Besides, we've got you to guide us." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of activity as the neighborhood came alive with purpose. Marco and Javier went door to door, gathering more signatures and spreading the word about the watch. Sarah helped organize a meeting at the community center to discuss logistics and assign responsibilities. Dante watched from the sidelines, offering advice when asked, but mostly letting the group take the lead. It was a strange but satisfying feeling, seeing the people he'd worked so hard to protect now stepping up to protect each other. At the meeting that evening, the room was packed with residents of all ages. Sarah stood at the front, clipboard in hand, while Marco worked a whiteboard, jotting down suggestions from the crowd. "We'll set up patrols in shifts," Sarah explained. "Nothing too formal, just a few people walking the neighborhood at different times to keep an eye on things." "What about communication?" someone asked. "How do we make sure everyone's on the same page?" "We're working on that," Marco said, adding group chat to the list on the board. Maybe a text chain or a WhatsApp group for quick updates. As the meeting went on, the energy in the room grew. People who had once kept to themselves were now volunteering to help, offering their time, skills, and resources. One man offered to print flyers, while another suggested installing security cameras at key intersections. Dante couldn't help but smile as he watched the community come together. It was a reminder of what people could accomplish when they worked as a team, united by a common goal. After the meeting, Dante stayed behind to help clean up. As he folded chairs and stacked tables, Sarah approached him, her expression thoughtful. "You seem quiet," she said. "Everything okay?" Dante nodded. "Just taking it all in. This is incredible." "It is," Sarah agreed, "and it wouldn't have happened without you." Dante shook his head. "This isn't about me. It's about all of you, stepping up and taking control. That's what makes a community strong." Sarah smiled. "Well, we couldn't have done it without your example. You've been our anchor through all of this." Her words warmed him, but they also reminded him of the responsibility he carried. The neighborhood was rallying, but there was still work to be done. Brutus might have been weakened, but he wasn't gone, and Dante knew better than to let his guard down. In the days that followed, the neighborhood watch began to take shape. Teams patrolled the streets, sharing updates and reporting anything suspicious. The simple act of being visible had an immediate impact, deterring petty crimes and making people feel safer. Dante spent his time mentoring the volunteers, teaching them basic strategies for staying alert and handling potential threats. He emphasized the importance of working together and avoiding unnecessary risks. One afternoon, he found himself working with Javier and a few of the teens who had volunteered. They were eager but inexperienced, their youthful energy sometimes overshadowing their caution. "Rule number 1, Dante said, addressing the group. You're not here to fight. If you see something dangerous, you call for help. Got it?" Javier raised a hand. "What if it's, minor? Like someone sneaking into a backyard?" You observe and report, Dante said firmly. The goal is to keep the neighborhood safe, not to put yourselves in danger. The teens nodded, their expressions serious. Dante could see the potential in them, and it gave him hope for the future. As the watch grew stronger, the neighborhood began to change. People who had once avoided eye contact with their neighbors were now greeting each other with smiles and stopping to chat. The fear that Brutus and his gang had sown was being replaced by a sense of unity and resilience. One evening, as Dante walked through the neighborhood, he noticed small but significant changes. Porch lights left on, children playing outside later than usual, and groups of neighbors chatting on their lawns. It was a far cry from the tense, guarded atmosphere that had dominated just weeks earlier. Sarah joined him on his walk, carrying a thermos of coffee. "Feels different, doesn't it?" she said. "Yeah," Dante replied. "It does." "You should be proud," Sarah said. "This wouldn't have happened without you." Dante glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about me. It's about all of us, working together." Sarah smiled. "You're a good leader, Dante, whether you like it or not." As they walked, the stars began to emerge, dotting the sky with pinpricks of light. For the first time in a long while, Dante felt a sense of peace, not just for himself, but for the people he had come to care about. The fight wasn't over, but for now, the community was stronger than it had ever been. And that, Dante realized, was a victory worth celebrating. The neighborhood was alive with the energy of transformation. The community watch had taken hold, and for the first time in weeks, people felt safe again. But for Dante, the peace was bittersweet. He knew Brutus wasn't finished. Men like him didn't slink away quietly. They waited, they planned, and then they struck when it hurt the most. Dante's instincts were proven right late one evening when a knock on his door shattered the calm. It was Marco, out of breath and pale. "Brutus is back," Marco said, his voice shaking, "and he's calling you out." Dante's jaw tightened. "Where?" "At the old community park," Marco replied. "He's got a crowd with him, says it's time to settle this once and for all." By the time Dante arrived at the park, the air was thick with tension. A ring of people had gathered, most of them from the neighborhood, curious and nervous. In the center stood Brutus, his broad frame lit by the pale glow of the streetlights. He wore a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes, and Dante could see the desperation hiding behind his bravado. "So, you finally showed up," Brutus called, his voice carrying over the crowd. "I was starting to think you'd chickened out." Dante stepped into the circle, his movements calm and deliberate. "I don't run, Brutus. You know that." The crowd parted to let him through, their murmurs hushed as the two men squared off. Dante's presence was steady and commanding, a stark contrast to Brutus's restless energy. "This ends tonight," Dante said, his voice firm. "No more games, no more threats. Walk away, Brutus, before this gets worse." Brutus laughed, but the sound was hollow. "You don't get it, do you? This is my town, my rules. You're just a soldier trying to play hero." "I'm not playing," Dante replied. "This isn't about you or me. It's about the people you've been terrorizing. They deserve better than this." Brutus's face darkened, his fists clenching. "Enough talking. Let's see if you can back up all that self-righteous garbage." The first punch came fast, but Dante was faster. He sidestepped, letting Brutus's momentum carry him forward, then delivered a sharp jab to his side. Brutus staggered but recovered quickly, throwing a flurry of wild swings that Dante dodged with practiced ease. The crowd watched in stunned silence, the sound of fists meeting air and the crunch of gravel beneath their feet the only noise. For every move Brutus made, Dante countered with precision, his military training evident in every step and strike. "You're too angry, Brutus," Dante said as he blocked another punch. "You're fighting to prove something, not to win." "Shut up," Brutus roared, charging at him with reckless abandon. Dante pivoted, sweeping Brutus's legs out from under him. The larger man hit the ground hard, and a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Brutus scrambled to his feet, his face red with rage and embarrassment. The fight continued, but it was clear to everyone watching that Brutus was outmatched. Dante's movements were controlled, his strikes calculated to disable rather than injure. Brutus, on the other hand, grew sloppier with each failed attack, his desperation mounting. Finally, Dante saw his opening. As Brutus lunged for him again, Dante sidestepped and delivered a clean strike to his solar plexus. Brutus doubled over, gasping for air, and Dante stepped back, giving him space. "It's over," Dante said, his voice calm but firm. "Walk away, Brutus. You've lost." Brutus straightened slowly, his breathing labored. For a moment it seemed like he might attack again, but then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a bitter laugh. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You think you've won?" Dante met his gaze, unflinching. "It's not about winning. It's about doing what's right. You can still make that choice." Brutus looked at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word. The crowd parted to let him pass, their murmurs growing louder as he disappeared into the night. As the tension in the air dissipated, the crowd began to disperse. Marco and Sarah approached Dante, their faces a mixture of relief and admiration. "That was intense," Marco said, letting out a shaky laugh. "I wasn't sure he'd actually back down." "Neither was I," Dante admitted, "but it had to end." Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her expression soft. "You did more than end it, Dante. You gave this neighborhood hope again." Dante nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. The fight had been about more than just stopping Brutus. It had been about showing the community that they didn't have to live in fear. And in that moment, he realized they were stronger than he'd ever imagined. The next day, the neighborhood was buzzing with talk of the showdown. People stopped by Dante's house to thank him, some bringing food or small gifts as tokens of their gratitude. The sense of unity that had begun to take root weeks ago was now flourishing, and Dante couldn't help but feel a quiet pride in what they had accomplished together. As the sun set on the quiet street, Dante sat on his porch, a cup of tea in hand. Sarah joined him, carrying a plate of cookies. "You okay?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "Yeah," Dante said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "For the first time in a while, I think things are going to be okay." Sarah nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "You know, you didn't just fight for us. You reminded us what it means to stand together. That's something no one will forget." Dante looked out at the street, the faint sounds of laughter and conversation drifting on the breeze. The fight might have been over, but the legacy of what they'd built would last. And for Dante, that was a victory worth more than any battle he'd ever fought. The days following the confrontation at the park passed in a haze for Brutus. His body ached from the fight, but it was his pride that had taken the deepest blow. For the first time in years, he felt small, defeated not just by Dante's fists, but by his unshakable resolve. The gang he'd once commanded had fractured, and the respect he'd clung to so fiercely was now just a memory. Brutus spent most of his time holed up in a dingy motel on the outskirts of town. The room was a mess of empty beer bottles and fast food wrappers, a reflection of his state of mind. He stared at the cracked ceiling for hours, replaying the events of the past weeks. Every humiliation, every failure burned in his memory, but beneath the anger and frustration was something else, something he wasn't ready to name. On the third day, a knock at the door interrupted his spiral. He groaned, dragging himself off the bed, and opened the door to find Marco standing there, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "What do you want?" Brutus growled. Marco didn't flinch. "To talk?" Brutus laughed bitterly, stepping aside to let him in. "Talk? What's left to talk about? You and the others bailed on me, remember?" Marco entered the room cautiously, his gaze scanning the mess before landing on Brutus. "We didn't bail on you, Brutus. We bailed on the guy you've turned into." Brutus slammed the door shut, his jaw tightening. What the hell's that supposed to mean? It means you used to be someone we could count on, Marco said, his voice steady but firm. Someone who looked out for us. But now you're just angry all the time. Picking fights you can't win, dragging us down with you. Brutus scoffed, sinking back onto the bed. You think I wanted this? I was trying to protect what we had. But Dante, he ruined everything. No, Marco countered, stepping closer. You did. Dante just showed us what real strength looks like. And it's not about scaring people or beating them down. It's about standing up for what's right. Brutus stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Brutus let out a deep sigh, his shoulders slumping. What am I supposed to do, Marco? He asked quietly. I've burned every bridge I've got. It's not too late, Marco said. You can change, but you've got to want it, and you've got to own up to what you've done. Brutus let out a humorless laugh. You make it sound so easy. It's not, Marco admitted, but you don't have to do it alone. I can help. Dante might even help if you're serious. At the mention of Dante's name, Brutus bristled, but the anger quickly gave way to something else. Uncertainty. Could he really turn things around? Could he face the man who had exposed his weaknesses and ask for help? I don't know if I can, Brutus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marco placed a hand on his shoulder. You can. But it's up to you. Over the next few days, Brutus wrestled with his demons. The motel room became his battleground, a place where he confronted the choices that had brought him to this point. He thought about the gang, the sense of belonging it had once given him, and how he had twisted that into something toxic. He thought about the people he had hurt, directly and indirectly, and the damage he had done. Finally, he made a decision. One evening, Brutus showed up at the community center unannounced. The place was buzzing with activity, kids playing basketball, neighbors chatting, and volunteers organizing supplies for a food drive. Brutus felt out of place, his imposing figure drawing a few wary glances, but he pressed on. He spotted Dante near the entrance, helping a group of teens fix a broken bench. When Dante looked up and saw Brutus, his expression shifted from surprise to guarded curiosity. "What are you doing here?" Dante asked, standing to face him. Brutus hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. I wanted to talk." Dante studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's talk." They stepped outside, away from the noise of the center. Brutus leaned against the wall, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I screwed up," he said finally. "I let my pride get the better of me, and I hurt a lot of people." Dante crossed his arms, waiting for him to continue. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Brutus said, "but Marco, he made me realize that I can't keep going like this. I need to change." Dante's expression softened slightly. "That's a good start, but it's not enough to just say it. You've got to prove it." Brutus nodded. "I know, and I will. I don't know how." "You take it one step at a time," Dante said. "Start by making amends with the people you've wronged. Show them that you mean it, and if you need help figuring out the rest, you know where to find me." Brutus looked up, his eyes searching Dante's face for any sign of mockery or judgment. Instead, he found something he hadn't expected: understanding. "Why are you helping me?" Brutus asked. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," Dante said simply. For the first time in a long while, Brutus felt a flicker of hope. It was small and fragile, but it was enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back from the edge. Over the next week, Brutus began the difficult process of making amends. He apologized to Marco and the other gang members who had left, taking responsibility for his actions. He visited the community center to volunteer, staying in the background and doing what he could to help. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when he felt like giving up, but every time he faltered he thought of Dante's words and the promise he had made to himself. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild not just his reputation but also his sense of self. And though the road ahead was long, for the first time, Brutus was walking it with purpose. The neighborhood was beginning to look brighter, both literally and figuratively. With the community watch in full swing and Brutus starting to take steps toward redemption, a sense of calm had settled over the area. For the first time in weeks, Dante felt like he could focus on something other than firefighting emergencies. But the calm was still fragile, and Dante knew it wouldn't last without continued effort. That's why, on a crisp Saturday morning, he found himself sitting at a small cafe across from Marco. The younger man had been pivotal in the shifts happening around the neighborhood, but Dante sensed he still carried guilt over his time with Brutus. Marco stirred his coffee absently, his gaze fixed on the table. "Thanks for meeting me," he said after a long silence. "Of course," Dante replied. "You've been doing good work with the watch. People are noticing." Marco shrugged. "Feels like the least I can do, after everything." "You've already taken the first steps," Dante said, "but I get the sense there's something else on your mind." Marco nodded, his hands tightening around his cup. "I want to do more. Not just for the neighborhood, but for people like me. People who get caught up in the wrong crowd because they don't know where else to turn." Dante leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" Marco hesitated, then said, "I was thinking about starting a program. Something for kids and teens, giving them a place to go, people to talk to, and stuff to do so they don't end up like I did." "That's a big idea," Dante said, impressed. "Do you have a plan?" "Not yet," Marco admitted, "but I know there's a need for it. I just don't know where to start." Dante nodded thoughtfully. "The first step is figuring out what you want it to look like. Once you have that, I can help you connect with the right people." Marco looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "You'd help me?" "Absolutely," Dante said. "You've got the right idea, and I've got some experience in organizing. Between the two of us, we can make it happen." Over the next few weeks, Dante and Marco worked tirelessly to turn the idea into a reality. They started small, hosting informal meetups at the community center to gauge interest and gather input from local teens. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of kids showed up, eager for a safe space to hang out and share their thoughts. Sarah, who had become an integral part of the community's transformation, jumped in to help. She worked with Dante and Marco to organize activities, recruit volunteers, and secure funding. Her charisma and knack for connecting with people proved invaluable. One evening, after a particularly successful event, Sarah and Dante sat on the steps of the community center, watching the kids play basketball under the glow of the streetlights. "They're loving this," Sarah said, nodding toward the court. "You can see it in their faces." "It's amazing what a little structure and support can do," Dante replied. "Marco's idea was exactly what this neighborhood needed." Sarah glanced at him, a smile playing on her lips. "And what about you? What do you need?" Dante looked at her, caught off guard by the question. He took a moment to think, then said, "I need to know that what we're building here will last, that it won't all fall apart if I step back." "It won't," Sarah said firmly, "because you've given people the tools to keep it going, and because you're not doing this alone." Dante nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. For so long, he'd carried the burden of protecting the neighborhood on his shoulders, but now, he realized he didn't have to do it alone. Meanwhile, Brutus was finding his own way forward. After his conversation with Dante, he had thrown himself into making amends, volunteering at the community center and helping with the new youth program. It wasn't easy. Many people were still wary of him, and he faced his fair share of skepticism and outright hostility. But he kept showing up, determined to prove he was serious about changing. One afternoon, Brutus found himself painting over graffiti on a wall near the center. As he worked, Marco approached him, a pair of paintbrushes in hand. "Need some help?" Marco asked. Brutus glanced at him, then shrugged. "Sure." The two worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic swish of the brushes filling the air. Finally, Marco spoke. "You've been doing good work." Brutus snorted. "Don't know if everyone would agree with you." "They will," Marco said. "It takes time, but they'll come around." Brutus paused, his brush hovering over the wall. "You think so?" "I know so," Marco replied. "If I can turn things around, so can you." Brutus looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks, kid." As the weeks turned into months, the program began to take on a life of its own. What had started as a simple idea had grown into a vibrant hub of activity, drawing kids and teens from all over the neighborhood. They played sports, worked on art projects, and attended workshops on everything from conflict resolution to career planning. The program's success didn't go unnoticed. Local businesses began donating supplies, and even the city council took an interest, offering additional funding to expand the initiative. One evening, as the program celebrated its 3-month anniversary with a block party, Dante stood at the edge of the crowd, watching with quiet pride. Marco was at the center of it all, laughing and chatting with the kids, his confidence growing with each passing day. Sarah was coordinating the festivities, her infectious energy keeping everyone engaged. Brutus, too, was there, flipping burgers at the grill and joking with a group of teens. Though he still had a long way to go, he was beginning to find his place in the community, a place built on trust and effort rather than fear. As Dante watched the scene unfold, Sarah walked over, handing him a soda. "Not bad, huh?" she said, nodding toward the crowd. "Not bad at all," Dante replied. "You should be proud," Sarah said. "This is your legacy." Dante shook his head. "This is their legacy. I just gave them a push." Sarah smiled. "Maybe, but sometimes that's all it takes." As the sun set over the neighborhood, casting everything in a warm, golden light, Dante felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The fight might have brought them together, but it was hope and hard work that had transformed the community. And for the first time, Dante allowed himself to believe that the best was yet to come. The neighborhood had blossomed into a vibrant, unified community. The transformation was undeniable. Porch lights stayed on later, children played in the streets without fear, and the once divided neighbors now greeted each other warmly. It was a testament to what they had built together. But amidst this newfound harmony, Dante knew there were still personal battles to be fought and wounds to heal. Brutus was one of those battles. Though he had thrown himself into the youth program and other volunteer efforts, Brutus's presence still drew mixed reactions. Some residents appreciated his efforts to change, while others remained wary, their trust not easily regained. Brutus felt the weight of their judgment, but he bore it silently, determined to earn their acceptance through actions, not words. One afternoon, Brutus found himself painting a mural with a group of teens on the side of the community center. The vibrant colors represented hope, growth, and resilience, and each brushstroke carried meaning. Brutus worked quietly, his focus on blending the hues of orange and yellow into a sunset. "Hey, Brutus," came a voice from behind. He turned to see Clara, the neighborhood's unofficial matriarch, standing with her arms crossed. She was one of the most vocal critics of Brutus's past actions, and her stern expression gave little indication that her opinion had changed. "Clara," Brutus said, straightening up, "what can I do for you?" She studied him for a moment, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. "You've been busy," she said, gesturing to the mural. "Trying to do my part," Brutus replied, his tone measured. "It's the least I can do after everything." Clara raised an eyebrow. "And you think painting a wall is going to make up for all the trouble you caused?" Brutus exhaled, setting his brush down. "No, I don't." but it's a start." The honesty in his voice seemed to catch Clara off guard. She softened just a little. "Actions speak louder than words, Brutus, and so far your actions are saying the right things. But trust takes time." "I know," Brutus said, "and I'm willing to put in that time." Clara nodded slowly. "Good. Keep it up." As she walked away, Brutus picked up his brush again, a small but genuine smile on his face. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step forward. Meanwhile, Dante had been observing Brutus from a distance, noting the subtle changes in his demeanor. There was a humility to him now, a willingness to listen and learn that hadn't been there before. Dante decided it was time to push Brutus further out of his comfort zone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dante approached Brutus at the community center. Brutus was fixing a set of benches, his hands calloused from weeks of hard labor. "Got a minute?" Dante asked. Brutus looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Sure. What's up?" Dante sat on one of the benches, his tone casual. "You've been doing good work here. People are starting to notice." Brutus snorted. "Not everyone." "That'll take time," Dante said, "but you've come a long way, and I think it's time you take the next step." Brutus frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's time to make amends with the people you've hurt the most," Dante said, "the ones you've avoided because you think they'll never forgive you." Brutus stiffened, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I don't know if I can." "You can," Dante said firmly, "but it won't be easy. Owning up to your mistakes never is. Still, it's the only way to truly move forward." Brutus was silent for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, where do I start?" Over the next few days, Brutus began reaching out to those he had wronged. His first stop was the young couple he had harassed at the pool party, the incident that had set everything in motion. He approached their modest home with a mixture of determination and trepidation, unsure of how he would be received. When they opened the door, their initial reaction was one of shock. Brutus stood on the porch, his hands clasped in front of him, looking uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "What I did that day was wrong. I was trying to prove something, but all I did was hurt people who didn't deserve it. I'm sorry." The couple exchanged glances, their expressions softening. After a moment, the young man stepped forward and extended his hand. "Thanks for saying that." Brutus shook his hand, relief washing over him. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. Encouraged by the interaction, Brutus continued his efforts, visiting other neighbors he had wronged. Each conversation was difficult, but with each apology, he felt a little lighter. He began to see the cracks in the armor he had built around himself, cracks that allowed genuine connection to seep in. One evening, Brutus found himself at the local diner, sitting across from Marco. The younger man had been a constant source of support, and Brutus was grateful for his friendship. "You're doing good," Marco said, biting into a burger. "People are starting to come around." "Feels weird," Brutus admitted, "being on the other side of things." Marco smiled. "You'll get used to it." As they ate, the door opened and Dante walked in. He spotted them and made his way over, sliding into the booth beside Marco. "Hope I'm not interrupting," Dante said. "Not at all," Brutus replied. "What's up?" "I just wanted to say I'm proud of you," Dante said. "You've done more than I expected, and it's paying off." Brutus looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "Thanks. That means a lot." The three men sat in comfortable silence for a while, the clink of dishes and the hum of conversation filling the air. It was a small moment, but for Brutus, it felt monumental. A reminder that redemption wasn't just about making up for the past, but also about building a better future. By the end of the week, the mural on the community center was finished. It was a stunning display of color and hope, a symbol of the neighborhood's resilience. Brutus stood in front of it, a paintbrush still in his hand, as neighbors gathered to admire the work. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, standing beside Dante. "It's more than that," Dante replied. "It's a sign that people can change." As the crowd dispersed, Brutus lingered, his gaze fixed on the mural. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because he finally believed he was capable of being better. The warm buzz of community filled the air as the neighborhood gathered at the pool for a long-awaited celebration. The once tense environment had transformed into a hub of laughter, music, and togetherness. After weeks of challenges, the people had come together to celebrate their progress, a symbolic acknowledgement of how far they had come. Dante stood by the pool's edge, watching as children splashed in the water while parents chatted at tables adorned with homemade dishes. The smell of barbecue wafted through the air, mingling with the sounds of upbeat music playing from a nearby speaker. It was a scene he hadn't been sure he'd ever see. A neighborhood that had once felt fractured now radiated unity. Sarah approached with a plate of grilled corn and a mischievous smile. "You're the guest of honor. Shouldn't you be mingling?" Dante chuckled, taking the plate she handed him. "I think you've got the wrong guy. This is everyone's celebration, not just mine." "Always so modest," Sarah teased. "But seriously, Dante, you should be proud. Look around. This is because of you." Dante scanned the crowd, his gaze landing on Brutus, who was manning the grill. The former gang leader looked relaxed, joking with Marco and a group of teens as he flipped burgers. It was a sight Dante wouldn't have believed possible a few months ago. "It's not just me," Dante said. "Everyone played a part." Sarah smiled knowingly. "Maybe, but they needed someone to show them it was possible, and that someone was you." The event was packed with activities: relay races for the kids, a raffle organized by the Neighborhood Watch, and even a pie-eating contest that had everyone laughing until their sides hurt. Dante participated in a few of the games, his competitive streak tempered by the joy of seeing so many people having fun. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the pool, the atmosphere shifted to one of quiet reflection. Marco stood on a makeshift stage, a microphone in hand, as he addressed the crowd. "All right, everyone. Can I get your attention?" Marco's voice carried across the space, drawing the chatter to a hush. "First off, I want to thank all of you for coming out today. This isn't just a party. It's a celebration of what we've built together, a community that looks out for each other, supports each other, and stands together no matter what." A round of applause rippled through the crowd, and Marco smiled. "Now, there's someone here who deserves a special shout-out, someone who's been the backbone of everything we've accomplished. Dante, get up here." Dante shook his head, laughing as the crowd began to cheer and chant his name. "You're not letting me get out of this, are you?" he called to Marco. "Not a chance," Marco replied, grinning. Reluctantly, Dante made his way to the stage. The applause grew louder as he took the microphone, his cheeks tinged with embarrassment. All right, Dante said, holding up a hand to quiet the crowd. "First of all, thank you. But let's be clear. This isn't about me. This is about all of you. The people who stepped up, who decided enough was enough, and who worked together to make this neighborhood what it is today." The crowd cheered again, and Dante smiled, his voice steady as he continued. "I came here hoping for a fresh start, but what I found was so much more. You all welcomed me, supported me, and showed me the power of what a community can do when it comes together. So, thank you for letting me be a part of this." As he stepped off the stage, the applause was deafening. Sarah met him at the bottom of the steps, her eyes shining with pride. "Well said," she whispered. "Thanks," Dante replied, his voice soft. The evening culminated in a fireworks display organized by a few of the Neighborhood Watch members. As the first bursts of color lit up the night sky, the crowd gathered on blankets and lawn chairs, their faces tilted upward in awe. Dante sat near the back of the group, content to watch from a distance. Sarah joined him, her presence warm and steady beside him. "Looks like they're enjoying themselves," Dante said, gesturing toward the crowd. "They deserve it," Sarah replied, "and so do you." Dante glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You think this will last?" Sarah nodded firmly. "I do, because it's not just about the watch or the programs. It's about the connections we've built. Those don't just disappear." Dante looked back at the fireworks, the vibrant colors reflecting in his eyes. "I hope you're right." "I am," Sarah said with a smile. "You'll see." As the fireworks finale lit up the sky, Brutus approached, his hands in his pockets and a hesitant expression on his face. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Got a minute?" Dante nodded, standing to face him. "What's up?" "I just wanted to say, thank you," Brutus said, his gaze steady, "for not giving up on me, for giving me a chance to fix things." Dante studied him for a moment, then offered a small smile. "You earned it, Brutus. Keep proving them wrong." Brutus nodded, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "I will." As Brutus walked away, Sarah looked at Dante, her smile soft. "See? Proof that people can change." Dante nodded, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over him. The night had been more than just a celebration. It had been a turning point, a moment that solidified everything they had worked for. The road ahead might still have challenges, but for now, the community was stronger than ever. And for Dante, that was enough. The sense of community unity had grown stronger in the weeks following the celebration. The neighborhood was no longer a collection of strangers, but a tightly knit group of individuals who supported one another. While the youth program continued to thrive, another opportunity began to emerge, one Dante hadn't anticipated but couldn't ignore. It started with a knock on his door one evening. Javier stood on the porch, holding a notebook and wearing an expression that mixed eagerness with nerves. "Got a minute?" Javier asked. Dante stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "What's on your mind?" Javier hesitated, fidgeting with the notebook. "It's about the watch and the program." "Go on," Dante said, taking a seat at the kitchen table. "Well, I've been thinking," Javier began. "You've been helping us a lot, teaching us how to look out for each other, how to handle stuff without freaking out, and it's been great, but I think we need more." "More how?" Dante asked, his interest piqued. "More structure," Javier explained, "like actual lessons or training, not just for us kids but for everyone. You know, stuff about teamwork, leadership, and staying calm under pressure, the kind of stuff you seem to know without even trying." Dante leaned back, considering the idea. "You're talking about leadership training." "Yeah," Javier said, nodding enthusiastically. "You've got all this experience and you've been showing us bits and pieces of it, but imagine what we could do if we really learned from you." Dante rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It's a big commitment. Are you sure people would go for it?" Javier grinned. "Are you kidding? Everyone looks up to you. If you started a leadership class, I bet half the neighborhood would show up." The next day, Dante floated the idea during a community meeting at the center. To his surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Parents saw it as an opportunity for their kids to learn valuable life skills, while the adults were eager to improve their own abilities. Within a week, Dante had outlined a curriculum and scheduled the first session. The classes would focus on practical lessons, conflict resolution, decision-making under pressure, and the importance of teamwork. It wasn't exactly what Dante had envisioned when he moved to the neighborhood, but he couldn't deny the potential impact. The first session was packed. Dozens of people filled the community center's main hall, from teens like Javier to older residents curious about what Dante had to offer. As he stood at the front of the room, looking out at the eager faces, Dante felt a flicker of nervousness. But then he remembered why he was there. Not for himself, but for them. "All right," he began, his voice steady. "First lesson, Leadership isn't about being the loudest or the strongest. It's about setting an example, building trust, and helping others reach their potential." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And it's not about having all the answers. It's about knowing how to find them." The session focused on a group exercise. Dante split the attendees into small teams and gave them a simple task: build the tallest structure they could using only spaghetti, tape, and marshmallows. It was a light-hearted activity, but it revealed a lot about how people worked together, or didn't. As Dante walked around the room, he offered guidance, pointing out the importance of communication and adaptability. Some teams struggled, while others thrived, but by the end of the exercise, everyone was laughing and sharing their experiences. "You see," Dante said, addressing the group, "leadership isn't about doing everything yourself. It's about bringing out the best in the people around you." Over the following weeks, the classes became a highlight for the neighborhood. Dante introduced more complex exercises, including role-playing scenarios and group problem-solving challenges. He tailored each lesson to the needs of the community, drawing from his military experience but adapting it for everyday life. Javier emerged as one of the standout participants. His natural curiosity and willingness to step out of his comfort zone impressed not only Dante but also the other attendees. Under Dante's mentorship, Javier grew more confident and began taking on leadership roles within the Watch and the youth program. One afternoon, after a particularly engaging session, Javier approached Dante with a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "How'd you learn all this?" Javier asked. Dante smiled faintly. "A lot of it comes from my time in the military, but the real lessons came from working with people, from figuring out how to bring them together and solve problems as a team." Javier nodded thoughtfully. "Do you ever miss it?" "Sometimes," Dante admitted. "But what we're building here? It's just as rewarding, maybe even more." As the classes continued, Dante noticed a ripple effect throughout the neighborhood. People were more willing to step up, to take initiative, and to support one another in new and meaningful ways. Parents reported that their kids were more confident, while adults said they felt better equipped to handle challenges. One evening, Sarah joined Dante as he reviewed his notes for an upcoming session. She leaned against the table, watching him with a mixture of admiration and amusement. "You've got a knack for this, you know," she said. "For what?" Dante asked without looking up. "For inspiring people," Sarah replied, "for showing them what they're capable of." Dante shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I just give them the tools. They do the rest." Sarah tilted her head, her gaze warm. "You're selling yourself short. What you're doing here, it's changing lives." Dante set his notebook down, meeting her eyes. "It's not just me. It's all of us, working together." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but every team needs a leader." As the weeks turned into months, the leadership program became a cornerstone of the community. It wasn't just about building skills. It was about fostering a sense of purpose and empowerment. For Dante, it was a reminder of why he had fought so hard to protect the neighborhood in the first place. And as he watched the people around him grow stronger and more united, he realized that the greatest victories weren't won with fists or words, but with the quiet, steady work of bringing people together. The transformation of the neighborhood had sparked a fire in many people, but for Marco, it had been a revelation. From being a hesitant ally to one of the driving forces behind the youth program and the community watch, he had discovered a purpose he never imagined. Yet, as the neighborhood grew stronger, Marco felt an itch to do more, something beyond the boundaries of their small corner of the world. One evening, after a long day of organizing activities for the youth program, Marco sat with Dante on the community center steps. The air was crisp, the faint hum of cicadas blending with the distant chatter of kids playing basketball. Marco glanced at Dante, his expression thoughtful. "Ever feel like you're meant to do more?" Marco asked suddenly. Dante raised an eyebrow, setting down the water bottle he'd been drinking from. What do you mean? Marco hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. Don't get me wrong. I love what we've built here. But I keep thinking, there are other neighborhoods, other places, that could use what we've done. People out there who don't have a program like this, who don't have someone like you showing them how to turn things around. Dante studied him for a moment, then nodded. You're thinking about starting something bigger. Yeah, Marco admitted. I want to take what I've learned here and bring it to other communities. But I don't even know where to start. Dante smiled faintly. You've already started. The fact that you're thinking about this, that you want to help others, it's the first step. Marco looked at him, hope flickering in his eyes. You think I can do it? I know you can, Dante said, and I'll help you figure out how. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and brainstorming. Dante and Sarah worked closely with Marco to outline his vision, a mobile program that could travel to underserved neighborhoods, offering workshops, activities, and mentorship. They called it Roots Rising, symbolizing growth and strength grounded in community. Sarah's knack for organization proved invaluable as she helped Marco create a detailed proposal. They pitched the idea to local businesses, nonprofits, and city officials, seeking funding and partnerships. To Marco's surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. One afternoon, as they reviewed potential funding options, Marco looked at Dante and Sarah, his voice filled with gratitude. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Dante shook his head. This is your vision, Marco. We're just here to support you. And you've been doing a damn good job of it, Marco said with a grin. As Roots Rising began to take shape, Marco faced challenges he hadn't anticipated. Securing permits, coordinating schedules, and handling logistics pushed him out of his comfort zone, but he tackled each obstacle with determination. Dante's guidance and Sarah's encouragement kept him steady, reminding him that setbacks were just part of the process. One of the most pivotal moments came during a meeting with a group of city officials. Marco, dressed in a borrowed suit and holding a stack of proposals, stood in front of a panel of skeptical faces. His hands trembled slightly as he began to speak, but as he described his vision and the impact he hoped to achieve, his confidence grew. By the time he finished, the room was silent. Then one of the officials, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. This is an ambitious idea, Marco. Why do you think you're the right person to lead it? Marco met her gaze, his voice steady. Because I've been where those kids are, angry, lost, and looking for something to believe in. I know what it's like to feel like you don't matter, but I also know what it feels like to have someone believe in you, to give you a chance to be better. That's what I want to do for them. The woman nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You've got my vote. With funding secured and a plan in place, Roots Rising launched its first event in a neighboring community. Marco, accompanied by a team of volunteers, including Sarah, Dante, and Brutus, set up a series of activities in a park that had seen better days. They brought sports equipment, art supplies, and a portable stage for music and performances. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of kids and families showed up, their initial curiosity turning into excitement as they participated in the activities. Marco moved through the crowd with ease, encouraging shy kids to join in and chatting with parents about the program's goals. At one point, Brutus pulled Marco aside, his expression uncharacteristically serious. You're doing good work here, kid, Brutus said. Better than anything I ever did. Marco smiled. Thanks. Couldn't have done it without what I learned from you and Dante. Brutus nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. Keep it up. You're making a difference. As the sun set on the event, Marco stood on the portable stage looking out at the smiling faces before him. He felt a swell of pride, not just in what they had accomplished that day, but in the possibilities that lay ahead. Dante joined him on the stage, clapping a hand on his shoulder. You did good today. Marco looked at him, his grin wide. "Thanks to you." Dante shook his head. "This is your journey, Marco, and you're owning it." As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah approached, a camera in hand. "Smile, you two," she said, snapping a photo before they could protest. "That one's going in the scrapbook." Marco laughed, the sound light and genuine. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. That night, as Marco reflected on the day's success, he realized that Roots Rising wasn't just about helping others. It was about proving to himself that he could be more than his past. And with Dante, Sarah, and the community behind him, he knew he had the strength to keep moving forward. The journey was just beginning. Brutus leaned against the hood of his car, staring at the quiet street before him. The past few months had been transformative, but the weight of his past still lingered. Every step forward came with reminders of the damage he had caused, the bridges he had burned, and the people he had hurt. Though the community had begun to accept his efforts, there was one connection he hadn't yet attempted to mend: his family. The idea of reaching out to his estranged sister, Clara, had been gnawing at him. She was his only remaining family, yet they hadn't spoken in years. Their relationship had crumbled under the weight of his choices, and he wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. But Dante's words about taking ownership of his mistakes echoed in his mind, urging him to try. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Brutus finally gathered the courage to visit Clara. Her house sat on the outskirts of town, a modest, well-kept home surrounded by a neatly trimmed garden. Brutus stood at the gate, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He felt like an intruder, his presence an unwelcome reminder of old wounds. Before he could talk himself out of it, the front door opened and Clara stepped onto the porch. She froze when she saw him, her expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Brutus," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" He cleared his throat, suddenly feeling like a teenager caught sneaking out. I wanted to talk." Clara's eyes narrowed. "About what?" "About everything," he said, his voice low. "I know I've messed up. I know I've hurt you. But I'm trying to be better, and I want to make things right." Clara studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Come in." The house was warm and inviting, filled with the faint scent of lavender and the sound of a clock ticking in the background. Brutus sat on the edge of the couch, his large frame looking out of place in the cozy living room. Clara settled into an armchair across from him, her posture stiff. "So," she began, folding her hands in her lap, "what's this about?" Brutus took a deep breath, the words he had rehearsed suddenly feeling inadequate. "I've been thinking a lot about the past, about how I let my anger and pride get in the way of everything that mattered. I pushed people away, including you, and I hate myself for it." Clara's expression softened, but she remained guarded. "And now I'm trying to fix it," Brutus said. "I've been working with the community, trying to make up for all the damage I've done, but none of it feels complete without making things right with you." Clara leaned back, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. "You hurt me, Brutus. You hurt a lot of people. Do you really think a few good deeds will erase that?" "No," he said quickly. "I know I can't erase the past, but I'm hoping I can build something better moving forward." Clara was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. Finally, she said, "Why now?" "Because I'm tired of being angry," Brutus admitted. "Tired of being alone. You're the only family I've got left, and I don't want to lose that." Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she blinked them away. "It's not going to be easy. Trust takes time." "I know," Brutus said. "I'm willing to put in the work." Clara nodded slowly. "All right, let's start with coffee." The conversation that followed was tentative but honest. They spoke about the past, their childhood, their parents, and the choices that had driven them apart. Brutus apologized repeatedly, his voice thick with regret, and for the first time, Clara saw the vulnerability beneath his tough exterior. By the time he left, the tension between them had eased. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a beginning, and for Brutus, that was enough. Back in the neighborhood, Brutus continued his efforts to prove himself. He took on more responsibilities within the youth program, mentoring teens who reminded him of himself at their age, angry, aimless, and searching for purpose. One boy in particular, a quiet 15-year-old named Luis, struck a chord with Brutus. Luis was a loner, often hanging back during activities and avoiding eye contact. Brutus recognized the pain behind his silence and made it his mission to reach him. He started small, inviting Luis to help him with projects around the center. "You've got a good eye for detail," Brutus said one afternoon as they painted a new sign for the program. "Ever think about trying something creative?" Luis shrugged, his voice barely audible. "Don't think I'm any good at it." "Everyone starts somewhere," Brutus replied. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to try." Over time, Luis began to open up, sharing snippets of his life and even joining in group activities. Brutus saw a spark of confidence return to the boy, and it reminded him why he had chosen this path. One evening, Dante approached Brutus after a community meeting. The two men stood outside the center, the cool breeze carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass. "You've been doing good work," Dante said, his tone sincere. "Thanks," Brutus replied, shoving his hands in his pockets. "Still feels like I've got a long way to go." "We all do," Dante said, "but you're on the right track." Brutus hesitated, then said, "I couldn't have done it without you. If you hadn't given me that chance, I don't know where I'd be." Dante smiled faintly. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Brutus. You've earned yours." As Brutus walked home that night, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The path to redemption was long and often difficult, but for the first time, he believed it was worth it. He wasn't just making amends. He was becoming the man he had always wanted to be. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Brutus knew he wasn't walking it alone. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of apple cider and roasted chestnuts as the neighborhood gathered in the park for the community celebration. This event was the culmination of months of hard work and transformation, a day to honor how far they had come. The park had been transformed into a vibrant scene of life and joy, with colorful banners strung between trees, tables laden with homemade dishes, and a small stage set up for speeches and performances. Dante arrived early, his ever-present calm demeanor masking a sense of pride. He had watched this neighborhood grow and change, transforming from a place divided by fear into one united by hope and resilience. He scanned the crowd as families arrived, their laughter mingling with the upbeat music playing from the speakers. Sarah appeared at his side, a clipboard in one hand and a walkie-talkie in the other. She wore her usual confident smile, but there was a glimmer of excitement in her eyes. "Looks like everything's coming together," she said, surveying the scene. "You've done an incredible job," Dante replied. "This whole event was your idea." Sarah laughed. "Oh, don't try to give me all the credit. None of this would have been possible without you." Dante shook his head, smiling. "Team effort?" The celebration kicked off with a series of performances from local talent. A group of teens from the youth program performed a dance routine they had spent weeks perfecting, their energy infectious as the crowd clapped along. A young boy played the guitar, his nervousness melting away as his sweet melody filled the air. Brutus, wearing an apron that read "Grillmaster," manned the barbecue station with a group of volunteers. He flipped burgers and cracked jokes, his booming laugh drawing smiles from those around him. For someone who had once been a source of fear in the neighborhood, he now stood as a testament to change. "Need a refill?" Sarah asked, holding out a fresh plate of buns. "Always," Brutus said, flashing a grin. "You're a lifesaver." Nearby, Marco was busy organizing a series of games for the kids. From sack races to tug-of-war, the activities kept the younger crowd entertained while their parents mingled. Marco's leadership skills had flourished in recent months, and it was clear he had found his calling. As the day wore on, the highlight of the event drew near, a speech from Dante. When Marco took the stage to introduce him, the crowd erupted in cheers, their affection for Dante evident in every clap and cheer. All right, Marco said, laughing. Settle down. You all know who I'm talking about, the guy who walked into this neighborhood and somehow turned it into a place we can all be proud of. Let's give it up for Dante. The applause was deafening as Dante stepped onto the stage. He raised a hand to quiet the crowd, a small smile playing on his lips. Thank you, he began, his deep voice carrying across the park. But before I say anything else, I want to make one thing clear. This isn't about me. This celebration is about all of you. He paused, letting the words sink in. When I first came here, I saw a neighborhood struggling with fear and division. But what I've seen since is a community that refused to give up. You've come together, supported each other, and proved that when people work as a team, there's nothing they can't accomplish. The crowd cheered again, and Dante continued. This journey hasn't been easy. We faced challenges, setbacks, and moments when it felt like the odds were stacked against us. But every time, we got back up. And that's what makes this community special. Not just the victories, but the strength and determination behind them. He looked out at the faces before him, his voice softening. I'm proud to call this place home, and I know that no matter what the future holds, this neighborhood will continue to thrive, because of all of you. The applause was thunderous as Dante stepped back, nodding to Marco as he returned to the microphone. Give it up for Dante, Marco shouted, and the crowd roared in response. The evening ended with a series of stories shared by community members. People stood on the stage recounting moments of triumph, gratitude, and personal growth. A single mother spoke about how the youth program had given her son confidence and purpose. A young man shared how the leadership classes had inspired him to pursue a career in social work. Brutus, to everyone's surprise, took the stage next. He stood awkwardly for a moment, scratching the back of his neck before speaking. I'm not good at this kind of thing, he admitted, his deep voice rumbling over the microphone. But I wanted to say thank you to this community, to Dante, to everyone who gave me a second chance. I know I've got a long way to go, but being part of this has shown me what it means to really belong. So, thanks. The applause that followed was genuine, a sign of how far Brutus had come in the eyes of the neighborhood. As the night wound down, Dante found himself sitting on a picnic bench with Sarah and Marco, watching the stars twinkle above. The park was quiet now, the last of the attendees packing up and heading home. A warm sense of accomplishment filled the air. Not bad for a little neighborhood shindig, Marco said, stretching his arms. Not bad at all, Sarah agreed, resting her head on her hand. This was perfect. Dante smiled, his gaze on the dark sky. It's a testament to what we can do when we come together. Sarah looked at him, her expression soft. You've changed this place, Dante, and not just the neighborhood. You've changed lives. Dante glanced at her, his voice quiet but firm. So have you. So has Marco. This was never just about me. It was about all of us. As the three of them sat in the peaceful silence, the faint sound of laughter and music still lingering in the air, Dante allowed himself to feel something he rarely indulged in. Pride. Not in himself, but in what they had built together. And as the night stretched on, he knew this was only the beginning. The crisp morning air carried a sense of finality as Dante packed the last of his belongings into the back of his truck. The neighborhood was quiet, the early sunlight casting long shadows over the streets he had come to know so well. This was the day he had been preparing for, the day he would leave the place that had become his home. Dante stood by the truck taking in the familiar sights. The once cracked sidewalks were now lined with flower beds planted by the community. The park, where kids now played freely, was a stark contrast to the tension that had defined the neighborhood months ago. It was a living testament to how far they had come. The faint sound of footsteps pulled Dante from his thoughts. He turned to see Sarah approaching, her expression a mix of pride and sadness. "So, this is it?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Yeah," Dante said softly. "Time for the next chapter." Sarah nodded, though her eyes betrayed her reluctance. "You sure you have to go? This place won't be the same without you." Dante smiled faintly. "That's the point. It's not about me. It never was. This neighborhood is strong enough to stand on its own now. They don't need me anymore." "We'll miss you," Sarah said, her voice catching slightly. "I'll miss you too," Dante replied. "But this isn't goodbye. I'll be back to visit." Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a small, wrapped package. "Here, a little something to remember us by." Dante took the package, unwrapping it to reveal a framed photo of the mural on the community center wall. Beneath it was a handwritten note. "Thank you for showing us what's possible." He looked up at Sarah, his chest tightening. "Thank you." As word of Dante's departure spread, neighbors began to gather. One by one, they approached him, offering handshakes, hugs, and heartfelt words of gratitude. Marco was among them, his usual grin tempered by the weight of the moment. "Didn't think you'd actually go through with it," Marco said, clapping Dante on the shoulder. "Neither did I," Dante admitted, "but it's time." Marco nodded. "You've done more for this place than anyone could have imagined. Don't forget that." "Neither will I," Dante replied. "And don't let up on that program of yours. It's going to change lives." Marco grinned. "You bet." Even Brutus made an appearance, standing slightly apart from the crowd before finally stepping forward. "You're a better man than I gave you credit for," he said, his voice gruff. "Thanks for giving me a shot to turn things around." Dante extended his hand. "You earned it. Keep proving them wrong." Brutus shook his hand firmly, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "I will." The final goodbyes were reserved for the kids from the youth program. They swarmed Dante, their chatter a mixture of complaints and promises to stay in touch. Javier, ever the spokesman, stepped forward with a handmade card signed by everyone. "Don't forget us," Javier said, his voice thick with emotion. "Never," Dante assured him. "You all have something special here. Don't lose it." Javier nodded, his usual bravado replaced by sincerity. "We won't." As the crowd began to disperse, Dante climbed into his truck. He started the engine, the familiar rumble filling the air, but he hesitated before shifting into gear. He looked out at the faces of the people he had come to care about, their smiles tinged with sadness but full of hope. "You take care of each other," Dante called out. "We will," Sarah shouted back, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. Dante gave them one last wave, then drove away, the neighborhood shrinking in his rearview mirror. The lump in his throat was a mix of pride and longing, but he knew he was leaving them in good hands. The road stretched out before him, an open canvas waiting to be painted with new experiences. Dante didn't know exactly where he was headed, but he felt a sense of purpose guiding him. The lessons he had shared with the neighborhood about resilience, unity, and second chances were lessons he carried with him. At a rest stop, Dante pulled over and opened the package Sarah had given him. He stared at the mural photo for a long moment, the message beneath it echoing in his mind. "Thank you for showing us what's possible." He set the photo on the dashboard, a reminder of what they had built together. The mural was more than just paint on a wall. It was a symbol of hope, strength, and the power of community. As he got back on the road, Dante allowed himself a small smile. His time in the neighborhood had left a mark, not just on the people he had helped, but on himself. He had started as a stranger, seeking a fresh start, and ended as a leader who had helped transform a community. The road ahead was uncertain, but Dante felt ready for whatever came next. He wasn't just leaving behind a legacy. He was carrying it forward. And with that, the soldier